I saw it because the road took my choices away. That's the part people don't get about black ice. It doesn't just make driving dangerous, it makes you a spectator. 1 second you're in your lane with the heater humming and the wipers slapping, telling yourself you'll be home in 10 minutes, and the next you're gliding forward on a sheet of invisible glass watching whatever is ahead of you get closer, while your hands do nothing but pretend. It was after my late shift, close to midnight, a winter night, where snow erased the edges of everything. Earlier, freezing rain had turned to a temperature drop, and now the asphalt looked dry, until your headlights hit it and it gleamed like oil. I was driving slower than the limit, both hands on the wheel, telling myself not to brake on curves and not to make sudden moves. I came up on a gentle rise, and my headlights poured down the other side. And that's when I saw movement in the far right lane, low to the ground. Wrong in a way my brain tried to correct before my eyes finished the message. At first I told myself it was a deer. That's what you tell yourself, because the alternative is admitting you're about to drive into something you don't understand. But a deer doesn't move like that. It wasn't bounding or trotting. It was crawling fast and deliberate, like it belonged there more than I did. It crossed the lane at an angle pale against the blacktop, and the weirdest part was how confident it looked, like it knew the rules of traction better than I did. I was far enough away that I had time to think. Brake gently, steer left, give it room. But the moment my foot touched the pedal, the car didn't slow. The engine note dipped like it always did, but the world outside kept sliding toward me at the same pace. My stomach dropped, and my hands tightened, as I realized I was on black ice, and my body was just going through the motions of control. The steering wheel turned, but the car didn't. The tires weren't gripping anything. It felt like the whole vehicle had been set down on a frozen pond. The headlights kept eating distance, and the crawling thing kept getting bigger, more detailed and less explainable. As I drifted closer, it lifted its head toward the lights. It didn't flinch. The face was the color of old paper, stretched too tight over sharp angles, and the mouth was open like it was breathing hard. But I couldn't see any breath. Its eyes reflected back at me in 2 hard points, except the reflection floated slightly, as if the eyes weren't exactly where they should be. Then it placed its hands flat on the ice. Fingers splayed wide, and it stopped. Not because it had to, because it chose to. It held perfectly still in the center of my lane, waiting. I realized with a clarity that felt like a slap that I was going to pass it at the speed I'd been going when I first saw it. Black ice doesn't let you decide to slow down just because you're horrified. It forces you to continue. I tried the horn. The sound vanished into the storm. I tried to aim for the narrow gap between it and the shoulder, but the car kept tracking forward like it was on rails. In the wash of my headlights, I saw arms too long for its body, and knees darkened, as if they spent a lot of time on pavement. In the half second before I reached it, it turned its head slightly, and I saw that it was smiling. Not friendly, not even cruel. It was the kind of smile you make when you're sure the next few seconds will belong to you no matter what the other person wants. I felt the car begin the tiniest slide to the left, the kind you can't correct, and I braced for impact that never came. I drifted past it so close I could have reached out the window and touched its shoulder if my hands weren't fused to the wheel. The air inside the car went colder, sudden and sharp, as if I'd opened a freezer door. I saw its fingers twitch, quick little taps on the ice, like it was counting. And as my rearview mirror caught it, I saw it rise, not standing the way people stand, but unfolding, pushing up on those long arms, until it hovered for a beat in a posture that didn't look stable, and then it dropped forward into a run. It ran on all fours, faster than any person could, and it did not slip. The ice that had turned my car into a sled did nothing to it. In the mirror, its limbs moved like a spider's, smooth and efficient, and it gained on me, even though I was still moving. I touched the gas, and the tires spun. More speed would only mean more loss of control. I was trapped in the cruelest kind of slow motion. The black ice kept me going forward, steady and helpless, while something inhuman closed the distance behind me with absolute control. I didn't look in the mirror again. I focused on the faint glow of an exit sign ahead, the green rectangle floating in the storm like a promise. And I whispered out loud to a thing that had never listened to me before. Please, please give me traction. The road dipped, and the surface changed. The tires hit salted grit, and the car shuddered, as if waking up. I felt the steering wheel become heavy again, brakes finally grabbing. I took the next exit too fast, sliding onto the ramp, and I didn't stop until I reached the first lit intersection of a small town. I pulled into a gas station under harsh lights, and forced myself to look back at the highway. Nothing but snow. I sat there with the doors locked, and called the highway patrol anyway, half expecting the dispatcher to laugh. She didn't. She asked for my mile marker, before I could even explain, and then she said very quietly that I was the third driver in the last hour to report a person on the roadway in that exact stretch. When I said it had been crawling, there was a pause, like she was deciding how much truth a stranger could handle, and then she told me to stay off the interstate and go straight home. I told myself it had been exhaustion. Then I stepped out and saw 4 long, clean lines gouged through the slush on my trunk like fingertips had dragged there. Under the lip of the trunk was a frozen smear, the color of dirty snow, the shape of a handprint. I got back in, locked the doors, and drove home on salted streets, checking my mirrors at every stoplight, afraid of what I'd see gaining on me when the road turned glossy again. The next morning, before the sun warmed the glass, I noticed the inside of my rear window had one clean finger-wide swipe through the frost, as if someone had cleared a view from the inside to look out. I saw it for less than a second and then I hit it. That's the cruel trick of winter roads. Your headlights give you just enough information to panic, and black ice makes sure you can't do anything useful with that panic. It was a rural 2-lane road cutting through pines late at night, with no houses, no streetlights, and no cell service. Just my beams, the hiss of tires on powder, and the hard glitter of the pavement that looked dry until it caught the light. I'd been warned about deer in that area, so when a pale shape flickered at the edge of the ditch, my brain grabbed the easiest label and slapped it on deer. I lifted off the gas and started to brake, gently. The pedal went soft. The car didn't slow. It didn't surge either. It just kept its same steady speed as if my foot wasn't connected to anything. And that's when I understood I was on black ice, and I was already committed to whatever was about to happen. The shape stepped out, not leaping, not darting, stepping like it had all the time in the world. My headlights caught it full on, and my stomach turned because it wasn't built like a deer. It was too upright, too narrow, the limbs wrong. For a split second I saw something that could have been antlers, and then I realized. It was arms raised over its head, elbows bent, fingers spread. It looked like a person pretending to be a deer, and then the front of my car met it with a dull, heavy thud. Impact on ice doesn't feel like you think it should. There wasn't a clean jolt. There was a wobble, a sideways slide, the steering going light in my hands and the sound of something scraping along the underside as my tires lost their grip. I fought the wheel, the way you fight a nightmare doing the motions you've been taught, but the car drifted anyway. I slid past the spot where I'd hit it, and kept sliding for what felt like an entire minute, until the road finally gave me a little traction, and I shuddered to a stop, half on the shoulder, half in the lane. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at my headlights pouring into empty snow. No animal lay in the road, no dark shape in the ditch, just snow, swirling in the beans. My first thought was relief. My second thought was worse. What if it was a person, and I'd sent them into the trees? I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my coat, and stepped out into air, so cold it stung my lungs. The shoulder was slick, and my boots squeaked on a crust of ice. I walked back toward the point of impact, sweeping the beam over the snowbank, expecting fur or blood or anything that would make this real. The road was blank. No body. No broken branches. No torn fabric. I bent down and found the only evidence a line of fresh tracks pressed into the thin dusting of snow on the asphalt leading away from my car. They weren't hoof prints. They weren't paw prints. They were bare footprints, long and narrow with toes. Human toes. The kind you only see at a beach, not in a freezing forest at midnight. They started right at the spot where I'd felt the thud, as if whatever I hit had landed on its feet and they didn't stagger or drag the way an injured person would. They were evenly spaced, steady, and they headed straight toward the trees. I followed them, because I couldn't not follow them. The beam of my flashlight made a little tunnel through the falling snow, and the footprints kept appearing at the edge of that tunnel, like a trail meant for me alone. They went off the road through the ditch and into the pines. For about 20 yards I could still see them clearly, each step pressed into powder over ice. Then the ground changed hard-packed crust, and the prints became faint. I slowed, listening. The world was so quiet I could hear snow landing on my jacket. That's when I noticed something that turned my blood to slush. The footprints weren't just going away from the road. A second set, lighter, fresher, was coming back toward it. Coming back toward my car. I swung my light from one trail to the other, trying to understand, and in that moment the wind shifted and carried a smell I couldn't place at first. Not blood. Not animals. Something like wet pennies in old basements. I should have run right then. Instead, I hurried back, the way I'd come, flashlight shaking. The returning footprints cut across the first set, and aimed not for the driver's side where I stood, but for the passenger side door. I reached my car, and the beam caught the handle, and there in the thin frost on the window was a clear print of fingers, sliding down the glass from the outside, as if someone had just steadied themselves there. I got in fast, locked the doors, and sat with my heart hammering, while the wipers smeared snow like blindfolds. I told myself it was a prank, a hunter, a drunk, anything that made it human. Then I heard a sound from the back seat, soft, like a coat brushing upholstery. I froze her. I live alone. No one had been in my car. I turned my head slowly and saw the rear seat empty, but on the inside of the rear window, in the fog of my own breath, a line was clearing as if a finger were drawing through it. I didn't wait to see what it wrote. I put the car in drive and tried to pull out, and the tires spun on the shoulder. For 3-6 seconds I went nowhere, engine whining while I imagined something settling in behind me. Then the tires caught, and the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached a lit area with actual traffic, and only then did I dare pull into a parking lot where cameras stared down like witnesses. When I opened the trunk to get paper towels, I saw something I hadn't noticed before on the inside lip of the trunk lid, where you can't see unless it's open. There were wet fingerprints. 5 pressed hard, as if someone had been holding on while the car moved. The prints were too long, the spacing off the kind of hand that would look normal only if you never had to shake it. I drove home on main roads in the slow lane behind other cars, refusing to be alone in darkness again. I didn't sleep much. In the morning I went back in daylight with a friend and a shovel, thinking we'd find a deer carcass in the ditch and laugh at ourselves. There was nothing. No blood. No fur. No broken branches. Just the clean edge of the blacktop and a thin sheet of ice, shining like glass. But beside it, right where my tires had first started to slide, were the footprints. Again, crisp in the thin snow as if they'd been waiting for me all night. My friend stared at them and said, "Those are not yours." Like that solved something. The prints began in the exact center of the lane and ended at the shoulder right beside where the passenger door would have been if my car was still there, and then they simply stopped, as if whoever made them had stepped up into empty air. That night, I went out to my driveway to take out the trash, and the passenger side window of my car was frosted over. In that frost was a clean arc, like a forearm had pressed against it from the outside, and below it, 5 long finger marks, dragged downward. I opened the passenger door anyway, just to prove to myself the seat was empty. Cold air spilled out, smelling faintly of wet pennies and basement mold. On the floor mat was a single, damp, bare footprint. Toes pointed toward my pedals, like whoever had been outside had already climbed in and was practicing the moment I would hit the brakes again. I shut the door and stood there, a long time listening for movement. I saw her too late to pretend she wasn't real, and too soon to do anything about it. That's the special kind of terror black ice. Gives you the moment your brain screams stop, your body discovers it has been demoted to passenger. I'd been on the interstate for almost 2 hours, late enough that the radio started sounding like it was talking to my fatigue. The temperature had dropped hard after sunset, and the pavement looked dry until my headlights hit it, and it gleamed like spilled oil. I kept my speed low, left extra distance, and told myself I was being careful. Careful. Doesn't matter when the road is glass. The stretch ahead opened into a long, gentle downhill curve through dark pines. My wipers kept smearing wet snow into translucent ribbons, and every time they lifted, the world looked sharper and more hostile. Halfway down, my headlights caught something pale in the center of my lane. At first, it registered as a reflection. Then it moved, and the movement had weight. She stood there, facing me, wearing a white dress that belonged at a wedding or a funeral, not on a highway in January. No coat, no boots, thin fabric snapping in the wind, damp hair hanging in ropes around her face. The detail that made my throat close was her smile, small controlled, like she already knew what I would do next. My foot wanted the brake. My mind said don't. On black ice, braking turns you into a spinning coin. I eased off the gas and tried to guide the car left into the empty passing lane. The steering wheel went light, and the car didn't respond right away. There was no tire, noise, no grip, only the sensation of floating forward on a sheet of invisible glass. I flashed my high beams to get her attention. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't step aside. She just kept smiling and watching me drift closer, and that's when I understood the worst part. I was approaching her at a speed I could not meaningfully change. My hands could turn the wheel, my foot could hover over the brake, but the car had stopped taking suggestions. As the distance collapsed, details sharpened the way they do in accidents. The hem of her dress was grey with road grime, as if it had been dragged. Her bare legs were stippled with goosebumps. I could see her feet planted on the pavement. Pale toes spread slightly for balance, and I waited for the natural slip a barefoot person should have on ice. Her feet didn't slip. She looked balanced, comfortable, like the road belonged to her. Then my headlights found the shoulder behind her, and the white dress stopped being the scariest thing in the scene. A pickup sat in the darkness, with its lights off, half crusted with snow. Two silhouettes stood near it, turned toward my car. One lifted an arm, and something glinted metal, catching my headlights for a split second. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a stranded pedestrian. This was a setup, and the ice was part of it. They'd picked a downhill curve, where you couldn't stop, where you couldn't accelerate, where you had to drift. The woman in white, ghost or decoy, was the bait. The truck in the shadows was the hook. I tried to steer wider left to keep distance from the shoulder, and the car answered late and gently sliding like it was negotiating rather than obeying. For a moment the nose pointed toward the left lane, and then the rear started to fishtail just enough to threaten a spin. My body wanted to stomp the brakes. I held the wheel steady and let the car glide because black ice punishes panic. I reached her, still moving. In the harsh wash of my headlights, I saw her face clearly, skin too pale, lips cracked, eyes open wider than normal. They weren't tracking the car the way a person's would. They were fixed, like she was staring through me. As I slid past, she lifted one hand and placed her fingertips against the air beside my window, almost tender, like she could feel the warmth without touching it. Then I heard 3 soft taps on the outside of my door, spaced like a code, as if nails were testing the metal. In the rearview mirror, the men moved. One jogged toward the road, slipping once, catching himself recovering too fast for the conditions. The other crouched near the shoulder like he was ready to grab a handle if my car slid close enough. The woman didn't look back at them. She just stood there, smiling, like the calm center of a plan. I tried the horn, and the sound felt swallowed by the storm. I tried the gas, and the tires spun without giving me speed. I was trapped in slow motion, watching the shoulder and the pickup in those shapes, and knowing that if I lost the last shred of control, they wouldn't have to chase me. The ice would deliver me to them. My tires hit salted grit, and the car shuddered as traction returned in a violent bite. The wheel went heavy. The brake pedal finally mattered again. I pressed it gently, felt the car slow, then accelerated. Instead, the safest choice. Once I had grip, and the engine's roar felt like a scream. Behind me, the man who'd run toward the lane stopped short. The pickup's lights flicked on for a second, not full beams, just a flash like a signal. And then, the woman in white did something that turned my fear from human to something else entirely. She stepped backward into the darkness of the shoulder. One slow step, then another, and she vanished. Not walked out of sight. Vanished, like a candle being snuffed. One moment she existed in my mirrors. The next moment, the road where she'd been standing was suddenly empty. I drove until I found bright lights and other cars and cameras. I didn't stop shaking until my hands hurt. When I called 911, the dispatcher didn't sound surprised. She asked for the mile marker first, like she already knew the script, and told me units had been sent to check that curve for a vehicle with its lights off. A state trooper met me at a gas station off the next exit. He listened, eyes on the dark road behind me, then asked one question: did I see the truck's lights? When I said no, he nodded and said people had been getting robbed on icy nights because the ice does the stopping for them. At dawn, I went out to my driveway and found 3 tiny crescent marks in the paint near my driver's side handle, like fingernails had pressed and dragged. Below them in the frost on the door, there was a smudged half-print, the faint outline of fingers. I told myself it was from my own gloves, from the cold, from anything that made sense. Then I checked the front bumper. Right beside the license plate was a faint smear of white fibers like snagged fabric. And in the grille, a single hair was frozen in place, dark, wet-looking, impossible to tell if it came from her or from the night itself. I pulled my dashcam footage. The curve played back in clean, indifferent pixels. The pickup never appeared. The 2 silhouettes never appeared. And the woman in white, she was there for exactly 2 frames, a pale blur in the lane, and then nothing, as if the camera itself refused to agree with my eyes. I don't take that road anymore when the temperature drops. But every winter, when the first black ice advisory hits my phone, I think about how steady she stood on a surface that stole control from everyone else. Sometimes on the first cold morning, I find a single clean swipe through the frost on the inside of my driver's side window, as if someone has cleared a view to watch the road, and the edge of that swipe curves upward at the end, like the beginning of a smile. I saw the car seat first, and my brain made the mistake of turning it into a child. That's what objects do on winter roads. They become stories in your head before you can verify them. On a dry night, you'd slow down, stop, call someone, be a decent human being. On black ice, you don't get to be decent or reckless. You get to be physics. It was after 1 a.m. on a county highway between small towns, no median and no shoulder. Worth trusting, just a shallow ditch and trees. My dashboard read 16 degrees. Every so often, the road would go strangely quiet. That dead silent glide that means your tires have stopped biting and you're floating. I'd been alone long enough that my thoughts were loud. Every winter you hear the same advice. Don't slam the brakes, don't overcorrect, don't stop for strangers on unlit roads, and you file it away like a rule you'll never need. That night, the rule was suddenly all I had. Coming out of a bend, my headlights caught it dead center in my lane. A child's car seat upright like it had been placed carefully. Straps dangling. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. My mind filled in a missing kid, a crash, an emergency. My foot moved toward the brake and I stopped it midair because the road ahead had that oily shine black ice. The straps weren't flapping randomly. They hung straight down, motionless, as if the air itself had stopped moving around them. The plastic shell looked too clean for something that had flown out of a crash, and the base sat perfectly square to the lane. I remember thinking absurdly that someone had aligned it with the yellow line, like it mattered. I eased off the gas and tried to steer left just enough to miss it. The steering went light. The car didn't respond right away. The seat grew larger in my headlights, with the slow certainty of a nightmare. At the last second, my tires found a gritty patch, and the car snapped, left missing it by inches, and the sudden traction whipped the rear back the other way. I fought the wheel to avoid a spin, but the car still slid onto the shoulder, and dropped into the ditch with a soft crunch. I ended up angled, half in the ditch, half on the road, hazards blinking. The tires spun uselessly when I tried to pull out. Black ice had delivered me exactly where I was most vulnerable. Stuck sideways, visible and alone. I grabbed my phone out of habit. 1 bar, then none. The screen reflected my own face in the dash glow. I locked the doors again, even though they were already locked. The inside of the windshield began to fog from my breath, and in that fog, my headlights turned into 2 hazy moons. Being stuck in winter isn't just about the cold. It's about the way your world shrinks to glass and metal, while the dark outside stays infinite. For a few seconds there was only my breathing. Then, headlights appeared behind the bend. Relief hit me, then died, when the car stopped a careful distance back and turned its lights off, like someone cutting the scene to black. A door opened. A man walked toward me on the shoulder, not slipping, not hurrying, moving like he already owned the situation. When he chose the passenger side, my fear sharpened into certainty. He wanted me to turn my head, to twist my body to reach across, to make myself vulnerable for a second. And he wanted the driver door side free for someone else. He came to the passenger side first. That detail mattered. Helpful strangers talk to the driver. He leaned toward the glass, and I saw his face in the strobe of my hazards, smiling, small, and controlled. He tapped twice and mouthed, "Roll it down." I shook my head and kept both hands visible on the wheel. I cracked the window a half inch, just enough to speak, and told him I'd already called for assistance, which was a lie because I had no service. His smile didn't change. His eyes flicked past me to my back seat, then toward the bend quick, like he was checking timing. He tried a different approach. He pointed at my hazard lights and made a cutting motion, like he wanted me to shut them off to save the battery. Then he mimed, pulling like a toe strap, and held up one finger, then two, as if promising a 2-minute fix. The whole time, he maintained that polite smile. It was the smile of someone selling you the idea that you need him. Another figure appeared near his car, staying in the shadows. Then, another moved along the snowbank, low and quiet. The man at my window tested my passenger handle once gently. When it didn't open, his knuckles rapped the glass harder. I hit the horn and held it down until my chest hurt. The sound tore through the night. Somewhere down the road, an engine growled deeper than a sedan, and bright high-mounted lights washed the trees, the kind a plow carries. In the next blink of my hazards, the shadows moved. The second figure retreated. The third slipped into the trees, and the man at my window stepped back like he'd never been there at all. They moved like people who understood winter. Not just the weather, but the psychology. They weren't in a hurry because the ice already had me. They didn't need speed. They needed my door to open my window, to drop my seatbelt to come off. They needed me to choose, and black ice was helping by making every choice feel urgent. A county plow rounded the bend lights, bleaching the world. The driver slowed, positioned his truck to block the lane, and walked straight to my driver window, speaking before he reached me, the way real help does, so you don't have to guess intentions. He radioed in my location, hooked a chain to my car, and pulled me out like it was routine. As I followed him to the next lit intersection, I looked back. The car seat was gone, not blown into the ditch, not crushed, just gone, and the road behind it looked perfectly clean like it had never been there. The plow driver didn't like that. He told me flatly that people set things in the lane on icy nights because drivers can't stop and they can't fight the slide. In daylight the next morning, I found a thin strip of clear tape stuck near my passenger door seal, like someone had marked it. Under my rear bumper, tucked behind plastic, was a small black box held on with a magnet. When I pulled it free, a tiny light blinked once, like it was acknowledging that I'd finally noticed it. The officer at the station didn't tell me much, but his face changed when he saw the box. He said winter makes everyone blame the road, and that's why traps work. You think the ice is the only thing trying to kill you. Now when the pavement goes glossy and quiet, and my tires stop making sound, I don't just watch the lane. I watch the edges, the shadows, and the places where someone can leave an object in the road and let black ice do the rest. A week later, I drove that bend in daylight and found a clean rectangle in the snow where the seat had stood. I saw the lights behind me and felt my whole body do the wrong thing at once. Relief first, then dread. On a normal night, flashing red and blue in your rear view means help, order rules. On a black ice night, it means you're being asked to make a decision you might not physically be able to execute. I'd been driving through a lake-effect blizzard that came in waves, white curtains swallowing the road, then thinning, just enough for you to see how alone you were. The highway was mostly empty. The kind of empty that makes you keep checking your gauges, like the car might decide to quit out of boredom. My speed was conservative. My hands were steady, and I was doing everything winter driving guides tell you to do until the pavement changed texture without warning. The tire noise vanished. That subtle hiss turned into silence. The steering went light, like I'd just rolled onto polished glass. Black ice. I didn't brake. I didn't jerk the wheel. I stayed calm and kept going. Because on black ice, your goal becomes simple. Don't give the slide an opinion. Then the lights appeared in my mirror, pulsing through the snow. Red, then blue, then red again. Too bright, too clean, as if the storm couldn't touch them. They weren't far back. They'd materialized in the distance and closed the gap fast, but not in a way that felt like a patrol car pacing you. It felt like something had been waiting with its headlights off, timing my approach. The lights came closer until the reflection painted my entire cabin in alternating color, and a siren chirped once, a quick, authoritative blip that made my instincts reach for the shoulder. The shoulder was buried in snow, the edge of it invisible, and I knew the road beneath was a sheet of ice. Pulling over on black ice is like stepping off a moving treadmill onto a floor covered in oil. But the lights stayed tight behind me, pressuring, and another chirp sounded sharper this time. I eased off the gas, trying to let the car slow naturally. The speedometer dropped by maybe 2 miles per hour. The world outside did not change. The car still floated forward, like the tires weren't touching anything. The lights behind me did not give more space. They held close enough that I could see the dark silhouette of a vehicle through the snow. I tried to make out the shaped light bar push bumper, the clean lines of a cruiser, but the storm smeared everything. What I did notice, because fear makes you detail-oriented, was that the flashes were wrong. Not wrong like I'd memorized police light patterns, but wrong like a heartbeat that skips. The blue hit twice in a row sometimes. The red lingered too long. The rhythm felt improvised. I told myself it was my perception through the snow that stress was bending time. Then I saw something else. There were no headlights, just the flashing bar lights. The vehicle behind me was following in near darkness, except for those pulses like it didn't want to light up the road for me, like it didn't want me to see what was coming. The next chirp came, and I decided I had to comply, because non-compliance with a real cop is its own problem, and because the longer I stayed on that ice at highway speed, the more likely the storm would end me anyway. I signaled right, and began the slowest drift toward the shoulder I've ever attempted. The car responded like a reluctant animal. It eased over a foot, then 2, then slid a little more than I'd intended. The right tires crossed onto snow and the whole vehicle lurched as the friction changed. The rear started to slip. For a moment I felt the beginnings of a spin. My throat tightened and I kept the wheel straight, heart screaming. Please catch, please catch. The car settled into the snowbank and slowed, not because I braked, but because the snow finally gave the tires something to fight. I stopped at an angle, half on the shoulder, half dangerously close to the right lane. My hazards blinked weakly in the storm. The lights behind me stopped too close enough that their flashes lit my rear window like a nightclub. I waited for the classic silhouette of a marked cruiser. I waited for headlights to swing and flood my mirrors. Instead, the vehicle behind me stayed dark, almost invisible, except for that pulsing bar. My skin prickled. A door opened. A figure stepped out into the blizzard and walked toward my driver's side, not hunching against the wind, not slipping. The way they moved was what set off the alarm in my bones. A person walking on ice fights for balance. They plant their feet carefully. This figure walked like the road was dry. They reached my window and tapped once, not the practiced firm knock of authority, but a small polite rap, like they didn't want to startle me. My window was up. My doors were locked. I kept my hands on the wheel where they could be seen. The figure leaned in, and the flashing red-blue made their face strobe in fragments. Pale skin a smile, then darkness, then the same smile again. They wore something dark that could have been a uniform in the right light. But I couldn't see patches, couldn't see reflective lettering, couldn't see anything that said law enforcement besides the posture. And then they did something no real officer does. They glanced past my face and scanned my passenger seat, then my back seat, like they were inventorying my interior. Their mouth moved. I cracked the window, a half-inch. The cold air knifed in. They said very softly, "Turn off your engine." It wasn't shouted over the wind. It was spoken like a request meant for only me. I didn't. I asked for their badge number. I asked where the marked unit was. The smile didn't change. "Turn off your engine," they repeated, same tone. And in the strobing light I realized their eyes weren't reacting normally. The pupils didn't tighten. The gaze didn't blink at the flash. It was steady in a way that made me feel like prey. I told them I was calling 911. I lifted my phone so they could see the screen, even though there was no service. They didn't flinch. They looked down at the phone, then back at me, and said, "Good." That single word hit me like a punch. Then they reached for my door handle and tested it, once gentle, like they were checking if I'd forgotten to lock it. I felt heat surge through my chest. I hit the horn. The sound blared into the storm and kept blaring as I held it down. The figure didn't jump. They didn't step back. They just stared at me, while the horn screamed and their smile widened by a fraction, like they liked the noise. In my side mirror, I saw movement at the rear of my car, another shape, stepping out of the dark vehicle behind me, staying low, approaching along the passenger side where I couldn't see them clearly. The lights kept pulsing. No headlights, no spotlight, no reflective markings. I understood then that the lights weren't there to identify them. They were there to blind me, to flood my cabin in color so I couldn't see the dark shapes moving around the edges. I put the car in drive. The tires spun in the snowbank. For a 6-second nothing happened, and I imagined hands on my door, hands on my trunk, hands on me. I kept the horn pressed and eased the gas. Not floor it, because flooring it on ice just digs you deeper. The tires caught a salted strip at the edge of the lane, and the car lurched forward, pulling itself free. The figure at my window stepped back smoothly, no slip, no scramble. I straightened out into the right lane and kept going, heart-hammering horn still blasting, until my lungs burned and I forced myself to stop. In the mirror, the flashing light stayed on my bumper for another moment, then cut off instantly. Not fading, not pulling away. Off, like someone flipped a switch. The dark vehicle vanished into the snow behind me, swallowed by the storm as if it had never existed. 10 minutes later, I reached an exit with a lit gas station and other cars, and only there did my hands start shaking visibly. I went inside and asked the clerk to call the police because I was too afraid to step back outside alone. A real state trooper arrived. Marked cruiser, headlights, spotlight, everything you're supposed to see. He listened with a tight face and asked the question that confirmed my fear. "Did you pull over at their request, or did you stop on your own?" When I said I'd pulled over, he nodded, like he'd expected it. He told me there had been reports of a fake unit working that stretch. On icy nights, people using light bars bought online, choosing blizzard conditions so drivers couldn't see the vehicle or uniforms clearly. Then he paused and added something that made my stomach go hollow. "But the ones we've been looking for always keep their headlights on. They don't want to hit anyone." I asked what he meant. He looked at my rear bumper and pointed. There, in the grime and salt, were faint handprints pressed into the dirt. 5 long fingers on each side, as if someone had held on while I moved. The trooper told me to file a report and go home. I drove the rest of the way in a convoy behind him, too scared to be alone with my mirrors. The next morning I checked my dashcam footage to prove to myself it happened. The video showed snow road, my car drifting right, and then nothing. No flashing lights in the mirror. No strobing collar in my cabin. Just my own headlights on an empty highway and the sound of my horn suddenly screaming into silence for no obvious reason. The timestamp kept moving calm and factual, while my memory insisted I'd been lit up like a warning beacon. I watched it 3 times. On the 4th watch, I noticed a detail I hadn't seen in the moment. Right before I pulled over, something pale crossed the far edge of my headlights, up ahead, low to the ground, quick as a thought, like a crawler moving parallel to the road. And then in the faint reflection on my rear window there was a single bright point that wasn't a light, an eye catching the beam watching me comply. I saw the debris right as my tires stopped making sound, and I knew I was about to be forced into a choice with no winning option. That's how traps work on black ice. They don't need you to do something stupid. They just need you to do anything at all. It was a 2-lane highway that curved through wooded hills, the kind of road locals treat like a shortcut and outsiders treat like a mistake. The weather had warmed slightly during the day, melted snow, then refroze after sunset, and the result was a road that looked merely wet until headlights hit it and it shone like lacquer. I kept my speed low, but the curve ahead had that deceptive geometry where you think it's gentle until you're in it. The moment I entered the bend, the steering went loose. Not dramatic, not a skid you can feel with your whole body, just that quiet, terrifying sensation of floating. Black ice. I held steady, eyes locked on the exit of the curve, waiting for the pavement to give me grip again. That's when my headlights picked up shapes, scattered across my lane. At first, it looked like wind-blown branches. Then the beam hit hard angles, reflective tape, the pale glare of plastic. It wasn't random. It was arranged. A line of debris had been placed exactly where the curve tightens, like someone had measured the point where a driver on ice is least able to correct. There were 2 cinder blocks, a length of lumber, and a shredded black trash bag that puffed and collapsed in the wind like it was breathing. My brain went through options in a fraction of a second. Brake spin, swerve spin, hit it damage, maybe a crash. I eased off the gas and tried to guide the car toward the narrowest gap between a cinder block and the center line. The car didn't answer. The tires had no opinion on my plan. The debris grew larger, inevitable. I remember the detail that made it feel unreal. A strip of reflective tape on the lumber the kind road crews use, shining, bright in my beams like it wanted to be seen. I clipped the lumber with my front tire and heard a crack that sounded like a gunshot inside the cabin. The steering wheel jerked. The car shuddered and slid wider into the bend. I didn't slam the brakes. I didn't overcorrect. I did everything right, and the road punished me anyway. The rear end stepped out, and the world tilted not visually, but in my sense of direction, like gravity itself had rotated. I spun once slow, and during that spin my headlights swept the woods and caught something that made my blood turn cold. 2 figures standing just beyond the tree line watching. Not running toward me, not waving for help, just watching, still as posts. Their faces weren't visible, but their eyes reflected back small points like animals, except too high off the ground. My car completed the spin and slid backward into the ditch, stopping with a soft thump that felt gentler than it should have. Silence followed, heavy and total. My engine was still on. My breath fogged the glass instantly. I sat with my hands on the wheel, listening for the sound that decides what happens next. Another car, approaching, a friendly voice, the crack of footsteps in snow. Instead, I heard nothing for several seconds. Then, faintly, a crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the woods. I checked my mirrors. In the dim reflection of my rearview headlights, appeared far behind me, rounding the curve, and for a brief moment relief washed over me. Another driver. A witness. But relief died when the approaching car slowed too smoothly and stopped well back, lights on, engine idling, not pulling alongside to check on me. The driver's door opened, and a person stepped out. They didn't hurry. They walked down the center line toward the debris, looking down at it the way a homeowner looks at a mess in the kitchen. They bent, picked up the shredded trash bag and carried it to the shoulder, placing it neatly out of the lane. Then they moved a piece of lumber, the same way calm and practiced, as if clearing the road was part of their routine. That should have made me feel safer. It didn't. It made me feel like I was watching stagehands reset a scene. Another shape stepped from the trees on my right, approaching the ditch where my car sat trapped. My doors were locked. My phone showed 1 bar, then none. I flashed my interior lights on and off in a reflexive plea, then regretted it because it showed them exactly where I was, and how alone. The shape reached my passenger side and stopped outside my window, head tilted slightly. In the wash of my headlights, reflecting off snow, I saw a face that could have belonged to an ordinary person if not for the expression blank patient, like time meant nothing. They raised a hand and pressed their palm against my glass. I expected it to slide on the frost. It didn't. The hand stayed, steady. 5 fingers too long. Then slowly the fingers curled, as if they were gripping the window itself, testing whether glass could be treated like a handle. I shouted more to prove I could than because I thought it would help. The figure didn't react. Another person approached from my driver's side, staying just out of my direct view, forcing me to turn my head if I wanted to watch them. I refused. I kept my eyes forward, scanning for the headlights behind me, trying to gauge whether that driver was help or part of the trap. The person in the road who'd been clearing debris walked closer to the stopped car behind and spoke to someone inside. Their posture was relaxed, conversational. Then the stopped car's headlights went off. Not dimmed, off. The world narrowed instantly. The only light now was my own beams trapped in the ditch, pointing at snow and dead grass. The darkness beyond my light felt alive. I realized I wasn't being helped. I was being isolated. The figure at my passenger window leaned down until their face was inches from the glass. Their breath should have fogged it. It didn't. They opened their mouth, and I heard a sound that didn't belong outside my car. A faint whisper that seemed to come from inside the cabin right behind my ear, as if the glass wasn't a barrier at all. The whisper wasn't words at first. It was the rhythm of speech without language, the way you hear people talking in another room. Then it sharpened into something simple and devastating. You can't stop. I felt my throat tighten. I didn't answer. I tried to start moving. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas gently. The tires spun in the ditch, throwing up powder that glittered in my headlights. The car rocked, but didn't climb out. The figure's hand stayed on my window, steady, almost affectionate. I switched to reverse, tried to back up and angle out. The wheels spun again. Ice under the snow kept stealing traction. That's when the figure, on the driver's side, finally revealed themselves by tapping my window, once the same small, polite knock I'd heard in other stories. The knock that pretends to be civilized. I didn't look. I stared, straight ahead, forced my breathing to slow, and thought about what black ice does. It turns the road into a conveyor belt. It turns your car into a package. It delivers you to whatever is awaiting. I needed a different kind of traction noise, attention witnesses. I hit the horn and held it down long and ugly, a continuous scream. The figure at my window didn't jump, but the sound changed the scene. In the distance, faintly, another engine note rose, heavy diesel approaching. The horn kept blaring, and the diesel grew louder, until bright work lights washed through the trees. A tow truck, real high, lights wide stance, moving with purpose. As it rounded the curve, the figures at my window stepped back, not scrambling, not running, just retreating into darkness with calm efficiency. The tow truck driver stopped close enough that his light flooded my car and made the ditch visible like daylight. He got out fast, shouting, asking if I was okay, and the fact that he spoke before he reached me made my eyes sting with relief. He hooked my car and winched me out with practice movements, and while he worked I kept looking at the tree line, expecting eyes to reappear in the glare. The tow driver asked what happened. I told him about the debris. His jaw tightened, and he said quietly, "They do that here, when the roads glaze." I asked who. He didn't answer directly. He just said he'd pulled 3 cars out of that same curve this winter, all after midnight, all with debris in the lane, and that the drivers always reported someone nearby when they crashed, someone who didn't help. When my car finally sat on the shoulder, I stepped out and looked back at the curve. The debris was gone. Every piece. The lane was clean as if nothing had ever been placed there. The tow driver frowned and walked the bend with a flashlight. He found something anyway, a strip of reflective tape stuck to the snowbank, and beside it a set of footprints that led from the woods to the exact spot where the cinder blocks had been placed. The footprints were long, narrow, and too crisp for how slick the surface was. They didn't show slips or stumbles. They showed certainty. I rode in the tow truck cab while he drove me to the nearest lit lot, and I didn't look back at my own car because I couldn't stand the idea of seeing a face in the rear window. The next day, when the sun came out and the road looked harmless again, I went to the sheriff's office to report the trap. The deputy listened, took notes, and nodded in the way people do when they've heard the story before, but don't say it out loud. He asked one question that stuck with me. "Did they try to get you to unlock the passenger door first?" I stared at him. He didn't look surprised. He told me they'd been investigating a string of winter road setups, debris on curves, fake breakdowns, staged emergencies, but that the evidence kept disappearing by morning, like whoever did it understood that daylight makes people doubt their own fear. When I got home, I found a smear of grey grit on the inside of my passenger window, as if a palm had pressed there from outside, and somehow left a trace inside. And on my dashboard, in a thin film of dust, there was a single clean line drawn by a fingertip. A straight path from the passenger side toward the steering wheel, like a reminder of what they'd wanted, not my crash, not my car, but my hands, leaving the wheel at the exact moment the road would take. Control again. I saw them before I understood what I was looking at, and by the time my brain labeled it the road had already taken my options away. Black ice doesn't announce itself with drama. It just steals the sound from your tires and makes the steering wheel feel like it's connected to nothing. It was a little after midnight, coming back from a friend's place on a 2-lane state route that cut through fields and dark patches of woods, the kind of road that feels familiar in daylight and predatory at night. Snow had stopped an hour earlier, but the temperature kept dropping, and the pavement looked dry until my headlights hit it, and it shined in thin, uneven bands like spilled oil. I was going under the limit heater, low defroster, fighting a losing war against my breath, wipers ticking as they pushed gritty slush to the edges. The road dipped, then rose, and on the crest, my beam spilled into a shallow valley and caught a car on the shoulder with its hazards blinking. A minivan angled slightly into the ditch, hazard lights, pulsing orange in the snow haze. Beside it stood people. At first it was just shapes, bundled silhouettes waving, and my first instinct was the one you're taught to be proud of, stop and help. Then my tires went quiet. It wasn't dramatic, just silence, and the faint, sick sensation that the car had become a sled. My foot floated over the brake, and I didn't press, because braking on black ice is how you turn a cautious night into a fatal one. I eased off the gas and held the wheel steady, trying to glide past without drifting toward the shoulder. The waving intensified. As I got closer, I could see there were 5 of them. A man, a woman, an older teen, and 2 smaller kids. They stood in a loose cluster near the passenger side of the minivan, all facing the lane, all waving in the same rhythm like a signal. The woman kept pointing down at the van, then toward my car, then to the ditch like she was choreographing my rescue. My headlights hit their faces in flashes as the wipers passed. They looked normal, at a glance. Red cheeks, winter hats, bulky coats. But something about the way they held still between waves felt rehearsed, like they were pausing for a camera. I tried to keep my lane. The car drifted anyway, a slow, lazy slide toward the shoulder, the kind you can't correct without overcorrecting. I felt my pulse in my hands. The man stepped closer to the white line, waving bigger now, and I saw his smile wide, and practiced the kind retail workers use when they need you to say yes. I cracked my window a fraction, even though I was still moving, and shouted that I'd call for help, that I couldn't stop on the ice. The wind took my words. The teen pointed directly at my driver door, and made a twisting motion with his hand like a key turning. Unlock. My stomach tightened. On the shoulder behind them, half hidden in snow, there was something dark and low to the ground that hadn't been there in my first glance. A second vehicle, maybe with its lights off. Or maybe just a shape my mind invented out of fear. The car continued to drift right. I could feel it the way you feel, a dream going bad but can't wake up. My right tires touched the snow at the edge of the shoulder, and the friction changed. The rear end started to swing. If I spun, I would slide down that little slope right into their arms, right into the ditch beside their van. Black ice was about to deliver me like a package. I fought the urge to brake, and instead feathered the gas just enough to keep the wheels turning, just enough to avoid that sudden weight transfer that starts a spin. The car wobbled, then settled, still moving, still sliding, and I crept past their minivan at maybe 25 miles an hour, close enough to see the kids' eyes track me with a hungry patience. As my headlights swept them, the smallest child stopped waving and simply stared, face, blank mouth slightly open. The man stepped off the shoulder and into the lane, not slipping, planting his boots, as if the asphalt were dry. That detail broke something inside me. Everyone slips on that shoulder. I was barely controlling a 2-ton car, and he walked like he had traction. He reached toward my driver handle as I slid by, fingers stretching, and I heard a soft scrape on the outside of my door. like a nail testing paint. The woman moved too, stepping closer, and for a split second her coat opened, and I saw something under it that didn't fit the scene. A length of cord maybe, or a strap, dark against dark, the kind you don't need to change a tire. My rearview mirror caught them as I passed. They flowed toward my car, in a loose swarm, no panic, no urgency, like they knew I couldn't accelerate away on the ice. Anyway, the teen jogged along the shoulder beside me, matching my sliding pace, and his hand slapped my rear passenger window once hard, leaving a wet print that immediately began to freeze in the wind. Then another slap on the glass, and another spaced, like he was testing for weakness. I hit the horn and held it down, an ugly continuous scream that felt childish and necessary. The sound tore through the quiet valley. In the distance ahead of me, a set of headlights appeared around the next bend, high, wide, with amber strobes, the unmistakable profile of a plow or a county truck. The figures behind me reacted instantly. Their waving stopped. The man stepped back into the shoulder with the calm speed of someone ending a shift. The woman grabbed the smallest child by the wrist and pulled, not gently, and the child moved without stumbling, as if their feet were glued to the ice. The teen disappeared between the minivan and the dark shape behind it, swallowed by shadow. The plow's lights grew brighter, and my tires finally found a salted strip. Traction returned in a sudden violent bite that made the wheel heavy again. My car lurched forward, no longer sliding, and the distance between me and them widened in a way that felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. In my mirror, the minivan's hazards clicked off at the exact moment the plow came into full view, like someone flipping a switch in a rehearsal. The plow passed me going the other direction, and the driver flashed his brights as if asking if I needed help. I didn't stop. I couldn't imagine stopping anywhere dark again. I drove until I reached a lit gas station and parked under cameras that stared down like witnesses. My hands shook so hard I had to hold my phone with both of them when I called the non-emergency line and tried to describe what I'd seen. An officer met me 20 minutes later and drove back with me to the valley, lights on. The shoulder was empty. No minivan. No hazard flash. No footprints in the fresh snow except tire tracks from my own car and the plow. It should have made me feel better. It didn't. Back at my driveway in the yellow porch light, I noticed something on my driver door that I hadn't seen at the station. 4 thin crescent scratches near the handle, like someone had tried to hook a fingernail under it while I was moving. Below the scratches frozen into the grime was the faint outline of a child's handprint, too small to be mine, pressed exactly where the glass would fog if someone stood close and watched me drive away. The officer suggested it had been stranded motorists who'd left before he arrived, but his eyes didn't match his words, and he told me very quietly to avoid that stretch when the roads glaze. The next morning, the frost on my windshield had 5 clean arcs scraped through it from the outside, like 5 people had stood there long enough to breathe and watch me sleep. I saw the truck because I couldn't see it, and that sounds insane until you've been alone on a winter highway with black ice under your tires, and a shadow the size of a building filling your mirrors without a single headlight. It was close to 2 a.m. A long straight stretch of interstate, running between exits, spaced far enough apart that you start thinking in miles instead of minutes. The storm had eased to a fine drifting snow, but the air was brutally cold, and the road had that glossy dark sheen that means refreeze black ice hiding in plain sight. I was in the right lane, doing a steady, safe speed, not braking, not accelerating, just trying to be smooth, because smooth is survival in winter. Then my cabin brightened, not with light ahead, but with a moving darkness behind me, as if something huge had stepped between me and the night. I glanced up at my rear view, expecting a semi with its beams blazing. Instead, I saw nothing but a taller than normal wall of black and 2 small pale rectangles hovering high in the dark, reflective markings, catching my taillights, the only proof the thing was there at all. No headlights. No running lights. Not even the faint amber dots that every truck carries like a necklace. Just bulk close enough that my mirror felt crowded, and the occasional cold wink of reflection when my brake lights flickered from a tiny tap. My first thought was that my eyes were failing from fatigue, that the storm and my own taillights were making shapes. My second thought was worse, Someone had turned their lights off on purpose. The distance closed until I could no longer see the road directly behind me, only the suggestion of a grill, the black mouth of it swallowing snow. A normal driver would speed up to create space. On black ice, speed is a gamble. I pressed the gas gently anyway, and the tires spun for half a heartbeat, that useless slip that tells you the road is glass. I eased back off. The truck held position maybe 2 car lengths behind, maybe less, so close that the turbulence rocked my car slightly, even in the calm air. I signaled left, intending to move to the passing lane, and let it by. The moment my left tires touched the center lane, the car went light again. That eerie silence returned. My steering input felt delayed, like the wheel was sending letters through the mail. I was on a strip of black ice between lanes, and now I was drifting sideways with a truck behind me that didn't have lights, and didn't seem to care. I corrected gently, heart hammering, and managed to settle into the left lane. The truck followed me into the left lane, without hesitation. Still dark, still close, still refusing to announce itself like a real vehicle. That's when I noticed the most unsettling detail. It wasn't tailgating like an impatient driver. It was pacing, matching my speed with surgical precision, holding the same distance no matter what I did. Like it wanted me to know. It could keep me in its shadow for as long as it wanted. I tried to let off the gas to slow and increase distance without braking. My speed dropped a few miles per hour. The truck dropped with me perfectly. I tried to accelerate again in tiny increments. It rose with me perfectly. The only time it changed was when a gust of wind pushed loose snow across the road. The truck didn't waver or drift. It tracked straight as a train. My hands began to hurt from gripping the wheel. I turned the radio on for company and got only static. Not the usual hiss, but a thick, layered interference that made my teeth ache. For a second inside that static, I thought I heard a voice low close, like someone speaking from the back seat. But when I turned my head, the back seat was empty, and the truck was still there, occupying my mirror like a wall. An exit sign appeared ahead. Green, reflective, promising light, and a gas station. I signaled right, deciding to get off, and let the situation reset. The moment I began to drift toward the right lane, the truck drifted too, staying with me. I took the ramp anyway, heart thudding, and the truck followed onto the ramp without ever turning on a single light. Now it was even more obvious, because the ramp curve forced my headlights to sweep across its side. In that sweep, I saw a trailer, tall and plain. No company logo, no reflective tape, except those 2 pale rectangles. The wheels did not throw snow spray the way they should. They rolled, as if they weren't touching wet pavement at all. I started to panic, the kind that makes you want to stomp the brakes just to make the world stop changing. I didn't. I kept gliding hands steady, because on black ice, panic is the lever that flips you into the ditch. At the bottom of the ramp, the road leveled, and a traffic light glowed red over an empty intersection. I slowed by easing off the gas, rolling toward the line. The truck rolled behind me, still close, still dark. I stopped with the gentlest brake pressure I could manage, and the car shuddered as the tires fought for grip. In the mirror, I watched the truck approach, and I waited for the hiss of air brakes. It didn't come. The truck kept rolling silent until it filled my rear window completely. For a heartbeat, I thought it was going to hit me. Then it stopped, so precisely that the gap between us looked measured, like someone had placed it with a ruler. No air release, no engine rumble, just presence. The red light painted my dashboard, and the truck's darkness behind me, and in that red glow I saw something that made my skin crawl. A pale shape leaned forward in the truck's windshield, as if the driver was finally coming into view. But there were no interior lights, and the shape didn't look like a person sitting upright. It looked like something pressed against glass, from the inside head too high, shoulders too narrow, as if it was standing on the seat to get closer. The light turned green. I didn't go immediately because my legs had turned heavy. Then my rear window fogged in a single sudden bloom, as if a breath had been exhaled directly onto it from the inside. I smelled wet pennies and cold basement air, impossible inside my sealed car. My body moved before my mind could argue. I hit the gas harder than I should have, and the tires spun, then caught, and my car lurched through the intersection. I glanced in the mirror. The truck did not follow. It remained at the light dark and motionless, like it had only needed to bring me there. I drove to the nearest all-night gas station, parked under bright lights, and sat with my hands shaking on the wheel until my knuckles hurt. When I finally got out, I looked at my rear bumper and saw a clean line drawn through the road, grime with a fingertip, straight and deliberate, as if someone had traced the exact distance the truck had kept from me. I checked my dash cam the next day, desperate for proof. The footage showed me driving alone on an empty highway. No truck, no shadow, no reflections, just my own taillights and the sound of static rising on the radio at the exact time I remembered the voice. But when I paused the frame as I changed lanes, zoomed in on the far edge of my mirror, I caught it for a fraction of a second. 2 pale rectangles hovering in the dark, and behind them a shape that looked less like a truck and more like a long, tall void that had learned to imitate one. Since then, whenever the forecast warns of black ice, I find the inside of my rear glass wiped clean in 2 neat rectangles, like someone has cleared eye space to watch the road behind me, and my radio presets reset themselves to static. I saw the shadow on the overpass a half second before the rock hit my windshield, and the worst part wasn't the crack spreading like a spiderweb. It was the certainty that I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. My tires had gone quiet moments earlier, that dead silence that means black ice, and the car was already in that gentle glide, where the steering wheel feels like it's connected to nothing. It was after midnight, on a long interstate stretch between exits, heater, humming, wipers, slapping gritty slush into the corners, and the pavement looked almost dry until my headlights caught it, and it shined like spilled oil. The overpass came up like a black bar against the stars, and in the last second before I passed under it, I caught movement at the top rail, just a smear of darker darkness shifting along the edge. Then, something dropped. The impact hit high on the passenger side, with a dull thud and a sharp pop. Fractures raced outward in bright white lines. A pebble-sized shard skittered across the dashboard and landed in my lap, cold as ice. My foot twitched toward the brake and stopped mid-air because the car was skating just enough that hard braking would turn me sideways at 70 miles an hour. The wipers swept over the damaged area and chattered, and each chatter flexed the crack like it wanted to open. Cold air seeped through the fracture lines, and the inside of the glass began to fog in uneven patches where my breath hit it. In the mirror, the overpass fell away behind me. For one frozen instant, my taillights caught the top rail, and I saw 2 bright points flash back at me, eyes too high and too steady to be an animal on the embankment. A second object fell and struck my roof with a metallic ping, then rolled down the back glass and thumped onto the trunk. That sound changed everything. A random teenager throws 1 rock for fun. 2 impacts, spaced and aimed, feels like a method. It feels like someone trying to make you pull over. But black ice doesn't let you respond like a normal person. Pulling onto the shoulder means packed snow over ice. Stopping means risking a spin. Speeding up means losing traction. All I could do was keep moving and pray for salted pavement. My phone showed no service. I turned the radio on for company and got thick static that made my teeth feel itchy, and inside it I thought I heard a low voice for a second, close enough to be inside my car. When I snapped my eyes to the rear view, the back seat was empty. Headlights appeared behind me, closing too smoothly for winter driving. Relief hit me witnesses other people, until the lights drew close enough to fill my cabin through the cracked windshield and turn every fracture into white lightning. Then the headlights went completely dark, not dimmed, off. The darkness stayed there anyway, crowding my mirror the way a truck does, as if the vehicle behind me was still pacing, but refusing to be seen. My stomach tightened. I tried a gentle lane change to get away from it, but the tires went silent again and the steering went light in my hands, and I had to drift back with slow, careful corrections just to keep the car from sliding. A green exit sign glowed ahead. I signaled early and eased right. The cracked windshield smeared the sign into a comet tail, and the wipers dragged over the damaged section with an ugly stutter. On the shoulder near the guardrail, a figure stood pale against the snow, head angled down like it was studying the lane. Bait. I didn't brake. I didn't stare. I kept the wheel straight and aimed for the ramp. Then something hit my car from behind. Not a collision from another bumper. A drop, a heavy thud onto the trunk that made the rear twitch sideways. The world rotated a few degrees, enough to put the shoulder in my peripheral vision and the lane line under my hood. I didn't slam the brakes. I made tiny corrections and whispered out loud, "Please catch, please catch." The tires found salted grit and traction, returned in a violent bite. The wheel went heavy. The car snapped straight. In the mirror, the darkness behind me vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. I took the exit and rolled into the first gas station under harsh white lights and a security camera. Only then did my hands start shaking so hard I could barely put the car in park. I got out and walked to the trunk. There was a round dent in the lid, as if something heavy had landed from above. But what stopped my breath were the prints in the road grime. 2 long handprints near the edge, fingers splayed, like someone had braced themselves, and below them 3 thin parallel scratches dragged through salt and dirt like nails, searching for a seam. A trooper arrived and listened while I tried to explain the overpass, the rock, the second impact, the darkness in my mirror, the thud on my trunk. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes kept returning to the handprints. At the gas station, he walked the dented trunk with a flashlight and stopped when he saw the 3 scratches below the prints. He didn't say they looked like nails, but he asked if anyone had been close enough to touch my car after I exited. When I told him I hadn't left the driver's seat until I was under these lights, his jaw tightened. He made a quick call on his radio, then told me there had been other reports on icy nights. Rocks from bridges, sudden impacts, drivers swearing. A vehicle followed them with no lights. He said most of those calls died in daylight because there was never a person to find and never an overpass to pin it on. Then he told me something that landed heavier than the rock. If you feel the road go silent again, don't pull over for anything that needs you to open a door. In the morning, I watched my dashcam footage with my stomach in knots. It showed the rock strike and the crack blooming across the glass. It did not show a person on the overpass, and the bridge itself wasn't there. The video showed open sky, where I swear concrete had been. Yet at the exact second I remembered the second hit, the audio picked up a single metallic ping from the roof. Anyway, sharp and undeniable. When I paused and zoomed in on the reflection in my rear window, I could make out 2 bright points hovering above the lanes like eyes that didn't need a body to look down. When I finally replaced the windshield, the tech pulled a small wet pebble from the inner seal and asked me how it got inside without breaking through. I didn't have an answer. I saw the trees laid across both lanes, like someone had dropped a forest in front of me and my tires were already silent. That's how black ice sets the stage. It takes away the sound first, then your ability to argue with whatever you're about to meet. It was close to 1A. M. On a 2-lane back highway, through pines and fields. No streetlights, no shoulders worth trusting. The day's melt had refrozen after sunset, and the pavement looked only slightly wet until my headlights caught it, and it shined like lacquer. 3 trunks blocked the road, cut clean and placed with care. Storm damage is messy and random. This was arranged 1 trunk angled to push you toward the ditch, another set to punish you if you tried to swing wide the last laid square across the center like a final answer. My brain did the stupid hopeful thing and tried to imagine an accident, a fallen limb, anything ordinary. Then I saw the pale wood at the cuts, still wet, and I understood someone had done this recently, maybe minutes ago. On dry pavement, you'd stop. On black ice, you arrive. My car kept gliding toward the trunks at the speed I'd been traveling when I first saw them. I didn't brake hard. I couldn't. I chose the ditch because snow felt better than wood. I eased the wheel right and felt the car respond late, then slide. The front tires dropped into the shallow ditch, and the rear swung, and I ended up angled hazards, blinking, half stuck, half exposed, with the blockade in my headlights, like a wall. Silence followed. My breath fogged the glass. My phone showed 1 bar, then none. I turned the radio on, and got thick static. And then I noticed the smell, faint, metallic, like wet pennies wrung inside a sealed car. A person stepped into my headlights, near the first trunk. Dark coat, hood up, face hidden. They looked down at the cut end, as if inspecting their work. 2 more shapes appeared along the tree line, spaced out like they'd been waiting for the slide to deliver me. None of them waved. None of them rushed to help. They just watched my car sit trapped in the ditch. The first one walked toward me on the shoulder without slipping. That detail made my stomach knot because I'd just skated into this ditch, and they moved like the road was dry. They came to the passenger side, not the driver side, like they'd already learned where the leverage is. They tapped my window once, polite, and leaned in. I cracked the window a fraction. Cold air knifed in. They said very softly, "You need to get out. The road's not safe." I told them I'd called for help, which was a lie. Their head tilted, amused. They reached for the passenger handle and tested it gently, like checking whether fear had made me forget to lock it. When it didn't open, they didn't get angry. They just tapped the glass again slower, like a reminder. Behind the trees, a chainsaw coughed to life. One quick, ugly burst, then silence. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. My chest went tight. I hit the horn and held it down, long and ugly, a continuous scream meant to summon witnesses. The person at my window didn't flinch. In the strobe of my hazards, I saw the edge of a smile, then darkness again. Another shape moved near my driver's side, staying just out of view, forcing me to turn my head if I wanted to track them. I refused. I kept my eyes forward and tried to pull out. The tires spun uselessly on ice under snow. Reverse, drive, reverse, again, nothing but wheel spin and the smell of hot rubber. The people outside didn't rush. They didn't need to. Black ice had already done the hard part. Headlights appeared around the bend behind me, high and bright, and relief hit so hard it almost made me dizzy. The person at my passenger window stepped back at once. The shapes along the tree line retreated, as if pulled by a string. By the time the approaching vehicle's lights washed over the blockade, there was no one on the shoulder at all, just trunks across the road and my car blinking helplessly in the ditch. It was a county plow, with amber strobes moving slow and steady. The driver got out with a flashlight, and spoke before he reached my window, the way real help does, so you don't have to guess intentions. He asked if I was okay, then walked straight to the cuts, and went quiet. He radioed in my location, and asked for a deputy, then told me flatly that these hadn't fallen. They'd been felled and placed. They set it for a glaze night, he said, eyes on the woods. The deputy arrived, took my statement, and asked one question that chilled me. Did they come to the passenger door first? When I nodded, he didn't look surprised. They cleared the trunks and escorted me to the next lit intersection. I drove home with my cabin light on, staring at my own reflection to prove I was alone. In the morning, I watched my dashcam footage because I needed proof. The video showed me entering the curve and the steering going light. It did not show the blockade. The road ahead was empty, but the audio picked up that brief chainsaw burst, right before my car slid like the night leaving evidence in the one place my eyes couldn't argue with. When I finally cleaned my car a day later, I found sawdust packed into the seam of my passenger door, and on the inside of that window, in the thin film of winter grime, there were 2 long fingerprints dragged downward, as if someone had tested the glass from within. The deputy told me people blame winter for everything, and that's why setups like this survive. You tell yourself, it was the weather, not intent. He said the county had logged other calls this season, where drivers reported a sudden roadblock on a glazed night, then found nothing in daylight. Before he left, he pointed at my passenger door and told me to check the seams for anything that didn't belong. I did. Under the rubber weather strip, packed into the fold like it had been pushed, there was a pinch of fresh sawdust and a single pine needle that hadn't come from my boot. On the inside of my passenger window, in a thin film of winter grime, there were 2 long fingerprints dragged downward, as if someone had tested the glass from within. 2 nights later, the temperature dropped again, and I went out to start my car before work. The windshield was frosted white, but the passenger side glass had a clean oval cleared through it at face height, like someone had pressed close and breathed. And below that oval were faint streaks where fingertips had wiped a better view. The radio, which I never touch, was tuned to static. In daylight that weekend, I drove back with my brother because I needed the road to behave normally in front of another witness. The curve was there. The ditch was there. No trunks, no branches, no tracks. But in the snow, along the shoulder, half buried and glittering in the sun, we found a thin strip of reflective tape, like the kind you'd wrap around a trunk, so headlights catch it, and a few long, narrow footprints that didn't show slips, just steady steps from the woods to the edge of the lane and back. Again. My brother said maybe we'd missed the spot. I knew we hadn't. On the drive home, every time the pavement turned glossy, I kept my hands locked on the wheel and refused to look at the passenger door handle because that's where they came first, and that's where black ice tries to make you reach. Some mornings when the first ice advisory hits my phone, I open my passenger door and find a fresh dusting of sawdust in the sill, like the road never stopped trying. I heard the seatbelt click beside me, even though I was the only one in the car, and because the road was black ice, I couldn't even afford the instinct to look. That's the trap of winter driving. At night, you're already fighting the physics, and then your brain starts manufacturing threats to match the helplessness. I'd been on the highway for hours, kind of late drive that turns your thoughts into a dull hum behind the heater fan. The storm had mostly passed, but the temperature kept dropping, and the pavement had that deceptive sheen, dark, clean-looking, almost dry until my headlights hit it, and it flashed like lacquer in certain patches. Every so often, the tire noise would vanish for a second, that quiet glide that tells you the road has become glass. When that happened, I'd stop making decisions. No braking, no sudden steering, just smooth hands and shallow breath. I was doing everything right. I was also exhausted. The radio couldn't hold a station. It kept fading into static that rose and fell like someone breathing on the dial. My wipers dragged gritty slush into crescents at the edges of the windshield, and the defroster fought the fog. My own breath kept painting back onto the glass. Somewhere around mile marker, nothing on a long straight stretch with no other headlights, I became aware of another presence in the cabin, the way you become aware of a sound that's been there for minutes. Not a voice. Not a movement. A weight. The passenger seat looked the same as it always did, empty dark fabric seatbelt hanging. But the air felt different on that side, colder, as if a door seam had opened. I tightened my grip on the wheel and told myself it was the vent. Then I heard it. The faint metallic tongue sliding into a buckle, the crisp click that you can't confuse with anything else. It came from the passenger side, low and close, and it was followed by the soft whisper of fabric settling like someone shifting their hips into the seat. My stomach went hollow. I wanted to jerk my head and confirm the obvious. I didn't because my tires had just gone quiet again and the car was floating. On black ice, you don't get to panic. Panic is a steering input, and steering input is a spin. I kept my eyes forward and tried to listen like an animal counting the sounds. The heater fan, the wipers, my own heartbeat. And then under all of it, a second breathing that didn't match mine. Slow, controlled, almost amused. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself highway hypnosis does this, that your brain fills an empty seat with a story to keep you awake. Then the passenger side window began to fog in a perfect oval at face height, not a general haze from the cabin, but a concentrated bloom like a mouth exhaling close to the glass. A thin line appeared through that fog, dragged clean by a fingertip straight downward, as if someone were testing how easily the condensation could be wiped away. I felt my throat tighten. The smell hit next, faint and metallic, like wet pennies, and old basement air wrong inside a sealed car. I checked the passenger door lock light without turning my head. It was on. I checked the window. It was up. I checked the glove compartment, the dashboard, anything that could prove I still controlled my environment. My phone sat face down, in the console dark. In the corner of my eye, the passenger seatbelt, which I'd sworn had been slack, looked tighter, angled as if it were pinned against a torso. I blinked hard and kept my gaze forward. The static on the radio thickened until it sounded layered, almost like whispers, under the hiss. For one moment inside that noise, I heard a word shaped like my name, close enough to be spoken from the passenger seat. I turned the volume down. The whispers got louder anyway. The road ahead dipped, and my headlights poured into a darker patch, where the asphalt shone like oil. My tires went silent again. The steering wheel felt weightless. Black ice. And that's when the passenger side headrest cast a shadow that didn't match the shape of an empty seat. It was the outline of a head slightly too tall, leaning forward, as if looking over the dashboard with me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed proof, one way or the other, because uncertainty is its own kind of violent. I waited for a moment when the tires sounded normal again, when I could trust the road enough to risk a glance. The sound returned in a faint hiss, and I flicked my eyes right. The passenger seat was empty. No person, no coat, no pale face. Just the seat dark and ordinary, and the belt hanging in its usual loop. Relief hit so fast, it felt like dizziness. And then I looked to the passenger side window and saw 5 clear fingerprints pressed into the fog from the inside. Exactly where a hand would brace if someone leaned close to the glass. The prints were long, the spacing off like a hand that almost fit human proportions but didn't. My breath caught. I flicked my eyes forward again because the tires went quiet once more, and the car began a gentle drift within the lane. I corrected smoothly, heart hammering. When the hiss of traction returned, I glanced right again. The fingerprints were still there. They hadn't been made by a draft. They hadn't been made by my imagination. They were proof of contact in a place that should have been untouched. I reached slowly for my phone without taking my eyes off the road, and hit the voice assistant with a trembling thumb telling it to call 911. The screen lit showed searching, then failed. No service. The passenger side buckle clicked again, this time not a fresh latch, but an unlatching metal releasing the short, dull snap of tension letting go. The belt slid back into its loop on its own. I stared forward and whispered out loud, "No." The whispering in the radio static stopped instantly, like something had been satisfied. A reflective green exit sign appeared ahead, and I took it without thinking. The ramp curved downward and the pavement looked even glossier, and for a moment my car floated again, but I didn't care. I needed light, people, cameras, anything that would make the cabin feel like mine. At the bottom of the ramp, a red traffic light held me over an empty intersection. I rolled to a stop. Gently brakes, barely engaged, and the instant I stopped, the passenger seat gave the softest creak like weight shifting. My entire body went cold. I stared at the empty lane ahead and refused to turn my head. In the corner of my eye, the passenger side window fogged in that same perfect oval again, and a single line drew through it, slow and deliberate, as if someone were writing without letters. The light turned green. I accelerated and didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit, all-night gas station. Under the canopy lights with other cars around, I finally looked fully at the passenger seat. Empty. Ordinary. I laughed, once sharp and ugly at my own nerves. Then I opened the passenger door to prove to myself it had always been empty, and cold air spilled out, carrying that wet penny basement smell. On the seat fabric, visible only under the canopy light, at the right angle was a darkened oval, like someone had been sitting there with damp clothes. And on the floor mat were 2 wet footprints. Bare toes pointed toward my pedals, as if whoever had ridden with me had been practicing the moment they'd take over when the tires went quiet again. I slammed the door, got back behind the wheel, and drove the rest of the way home with the passenger seatbelt buckled tight across emptiness, because I couldn't stand the sound it made when it clicked by itself. I watched my own car crash in my headlights before it actually happened, and if the road hadn't been black ice, I would have stopped right there and never driven another mile. It was one of those winter nights where everything feels sharpened by cold. The stars too bright, the air too brittle, the road too dark. And the danger isn't the snow you can see. It's the invisible glaze you only notice when your tires go quiet and your steering wheel starts lying. I'd been driving the same route I always drove, a rural state highway, with long gentle curves in open fields that make the wind feel like it's hunting you. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and there were warning signs about black ice on bridges, but the whole road might as well have been a bridge. I was tired, not drunk, not reckless, just tired enough that the world sometimes looked a fraction of a second delayed like a video buffer. My wipers moved with a steady hypnotic rhythm. The heater fan made the cabin feel smaller, The radio was set low, but it kept dipping into static in the same places, as if the landscape itself interfered with sound. I'd just crossed a shallow creek and started up a rise when my tires went silent. The sensation crawled up my spine. Black ice. I eased off the gas and held my lion eyes wide, waiting for the road to give me grip again. At the top of the rise, my headlights spilled down into the dip ahead, and there sitting in my lane was my car. My exact car. Same color. Same shape. Same little bumper sticker I'd forgotten I had. It was wrecked nose crushed into the guardrail, hazard lights blinking weakly in the snow haze, and the driver's side door hung open like a broken jaw. For a heartbeat, my mind refused the image. It tried to turn it into a different make, a similar model. Then the beam hit the rear plate, and I saw my own plate number. I felt my brain stutter, a hard glitch of disbelief, because the only way that could be real was if time had folded, and I was looking at my own future like it had already happened. My foot hovered over the brake. The road was glass. If I slammed the brakes, I would become the wreck I was staring at. If I swerved, I would spin. Black ice demanded smoothness, and smoothness demanded I keep moving toward the thing that should have been impossible. The hazard lights on the wreck blinked once, twice, and with each blink I saw different details. The spiderweb crack across the windshield, the white steam hissing from under the hood, the dark smear on the snow where a tire had carved a spit, helpless arc. And then, in the open driver door, I saw a figure slumped against the seatbelt head, tilted, wrong hair familiar. My hair. A surge of nausea hit so hard I nearly gagged. I whispered out loud, "That's me," and the words sounded ridiculous in the sealed cabin like a child telling a ghost story. The radio, which had been low, surged into pure static, loud and thick, and inside it, I heard a faint layered whisper that didn't feel like a broadcast at all. My hands locked on the wheel. I kept my eyes forward and told myself it was fatigue, it was a hallucination, it was a trick of glare on ice. Then my headlights swept slightly as the car drifted, and the wreck ahead changed angle and vanished. Not moved. Not disappeared behind a curve. Vanished like a frame cut out of a film. One moment my wrecked car occupied the lane. The next moment the road was empty, black, and shining, stretching ahead as if nothing had ever been there. My breath came in short, sharp pulls. I searched the ditches with my eyes. Nothing. No guardrail damage. No blinking hazards. No debris. Just an empty dip and the steady tick of wipers. Relief tried to rise. It couldn't because the image had been too specific, too detailed, and because the number on the plate had been mine. I reached for my phone and turned on the camera, aiming it at the road ahead. Recording like that could anchor reality. The screen showed the same empty highway. My hands still shook. I slowed as much as I dared, without braking, letting the car roll down to a safer speed, and that's when the tires went silent again, longer this time. The steering went light. The car began a subtle drift toward the center line. I corrected gently, and the rear answered by sliding the other way, a slow fishtail that made the world tilt. My heart hammered. I kept my movements small. I feathered the gas just enough to keep the wheels turning. The car straightened, then drifted again, as if the ice wanted to remind me that control was conditional. Ahead, a bridge approached the shallow creek again, the same one I'd crossed minutes earlier, except that made no sense because I'd just crossed it. The sign for it, a reflective yellow arrow, looked slightly scuffed in the exact same pattern I'd seen earlier. The radio fell into the same static pocket. My stomach tightened as recognition bloomed into dread. I wasn't just driving a road. I was driving a loop. The dip, the rise, the creek, the same wind line across the field it repeated with the subtle precision of a nightmare. I checked my odometer. It hadn't advanced the way it should have. I checked the clock. The minutes were moving, but the landscape wasn't. I told myself maybe I'd missed a turn, maybe I'd circled back without noticing, but the highway was straight for miles. There was nowhere to loop. And then I crested the rise again, and my headlights spilled into the dip, and my wrecked car was there again, waiting in my lane, like a prediction refusing to be ignored. The hazard lights blinked. The open door hung. The plate number stared back at me. This time, I didn't look at the figure slumped inside. I couldn't. I focused on the space to the right, where the shoulder widened slightly before the guardrail, and I made the slowest, gentlest drift I've ever attempted. aiming to pass the wreck with inches to spare. The tires were silent. The car floated. I could feel the road making the decisions. As I approached, the interior of the wreck flashed in my beams, and I saw the seatbelt stretched tight across that slumped shape, and for a split second the head lifted. I saw my own face turn toward me, eyes open, mouth forming a word I couldn't hear. The radio static spiked, and the whisper inside it synchronized with the shape of that mouth like the sound was coming from the wreck into my cabin. My hands shook so hard I thought I'd lose the wheel. I slid past the wreck close enough to see the crack pattern on its windshield, an exact match to the crack pattern on my windshield that didn't exist yet. The moment my rearview mirror should have caught it, the wreck vanished again. The road behind me was empty. I pulled onto the first gravel turnout I could find, and stopped under a bare utility pole, hazards blinking, heart pounding like it wanted out. I got out and walked around my own car, with my phone flashlight desperate to prove it wasn't already damaged. My bumper was intact. My windshield was clean. No crack, no steam, no blood. The night air smelled only of cold and exhaust. I laughed shakily, the sound of someone trying to convince their body to stand down. Then I saw the faint scuff on my front right tire, a new scrape that hadn't been there earlier, and beside it, a smear of grey grit, like salt, mixed with something darker. I looked up at the road and realized my car was angled slightly wrong, nose pointing closer to the guardrail than I'd intended. As if even parked, the ice wanted to continue the story. I drove the rest of the way home at a crawl, white-knuckled, taking side roads, avoiding bridges, avoiding dips, avoiding anything that shone. I made it. I slept badly. The next morning the temperature warmed just enough to soften the ice, and I convinced myself the night had been exhaustion and fear. Then, on my lunch break, I opened my phone gallery to delete the recording I'd made as proof, and I froze. The video I'd taken while driving showed the empty dip, the rise, the black road shining. And in the lower corner of the frame, reflected faintly in my dashboard trim, was the blink of hazard lights that weren't mine. One blink, then another. The timestamp matched the minute I'd sworn I was staring at my own wreck. I zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, and in the fractured reflection I could make out the edge of a license plate with my numbers on it reversed like a mirror, and a pale face turning to look directly into my cabin as if it had been, riding beside me the entire time, just waiting for black ice to make the prediction come true. I saw the town, because the ice forced me to take the exit, and once you're off the interstate on a glaze night, you learn how quickly finding help becomes finding a place no one will come looking. I'd been driving on black ice for what felt like an hour, tires going quiet in patches, steering, turning light, radio dipping into static like the air itself didn't want me to hear anything human. My phone was useless. Every time I tried to call out, it flickered between one bar and none, like the signal was being teased away. Then the dashboard fuel light came on, and it wasn't panic at first, just that cold, practical dread. If I run out of gas on this road, the ice will park me wherever it wants. The next exit sign appeared out of the snow haze, a green rectangle glowing like a promise. I took it because I didn't have the luxury of staying committed to the highway. The ramp curved down, glossy as black glass, and I rolled the gentlest brake pressure I could manage. Hands, steady breath, shallow, letting gravity do most of the slowing. At the bottom, the world should have been empty fields and a dark county road. Instead, my headlights found streetlights, real ones, yellow pools of light, evenly spaced, leading into a small town that looked like it had been dropped into the countryside from another decade. The first thing I saw was a lit diner sign, neon buzzing faintly even through the closed windows of my car. Then a row of storefronts with Christmas lights still hanging despite it being after New Year's, as if time had gotten stuck on the holiday and never moved on. Relief hit me so hard it almost made me laugh. A town meant gas, warmth, people, cameras, witnesses. I looked down at my GPS to confirm the name, and my stomach tightened. The screen showed my arrow floating on a blank grey stretch, labelled only as County Road, with nothing around it but empty forest. No town name, no street grid, no points of interest, not even the little gas pump icon you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. I zoomed out. Same thing. Zoomed in. Still nothing. The map insisted I was driving through unincorporated nothing. My eyes insisted there were storefronts and stoplights, and a diner sign flickering like a heartbeat. I told myself it was a glitch. Cold, affecting the phone, bad reception, outdated maps. Then my radio dropped into thick static, and in that static I thought I heard the faintest layered murmur like a crowd inside the noise. I turned it off. The silence that followed felt heavier than the static. I drove slowly down the main street. Snow lay undisturbed at the curb, smooth as if no plow had touched it. Yet the street itself was clear, dark, wet-looking, and shining in patches the way glazed ice shines. My tires went quiet for half a second and my hands tightened. Even here, even under streetlights, the road still wanted to take control. A gas station appeared at the far end. One pump island. Lights on. No cars. No moving shadows. I pulled in, parked under the canopy, and sat for a moment with my fingers still clamped around the wheel, listening. No footsteps. No distant engines. No voices. Just the soft tick of my cooling engine and the faint electrical buzz of the lights overhead. I got out, and the cold hit me like a slap. The air smelled wrong. Not just winter clean, but metallic like wet pennies, like old basement pipes, as if the town itself had a damp taste. The pump was old, with a small digital screen that glowed too bright and too clean. I slid my card. It processed instantly. No delay, no network error, which was strange because my phone couldn't even hold a single bar. The pump began to whir. The sound was comforting in a primitive way, fuel moving a machine, doing what it was built to do. I looked up and realized there were no security cameras on the canopy corners. No obvious lenses. No reflective domes. Just blank metal. That didn't make sense. Even the worst little rural station has a camera now. I turned to check the storefront window, expecting to see a clock, a TV movement. The store was lit, but looked staged shelves, perfectly faced. No handwritten signs, no scuff marks, on the floor near the register. It was clean in the way a room is clean before anyone has lived in it. When the pump clicked off, I went inside anyway, because I needed warmth, and I needed a human voice to reset my brain. A bell should have chimed. It didn't. The air inside was warmer, but not by much, and it carried that same wet penny basement smell under the faint sweetness of old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects. Behind the counter stood a man in a dark hoodie, hands on the edge of the register, staring at me with an expression that was almost polite but not quite human. His eyes didn't blink on a normal rhythm. They felt fixed, like he'd been waiting for the door to open. I said hello. He nodded once, slow. I asked if the roads were being treated, if there was a plow route, if the interstate was safer. He didn't answer in full sentences. He said, "It's slick." His voice was flat, like he was repeating a line he'd said many times. I bought a bottle of water and a pack of gum, just to force an ordinary transaction. He rang it up without looking down. The register beeped with a thin, outdated tone. When the receipt printed, it came out warm and almost damp. I glanced at it, and my throat tightened again. No address, no phone number, no store name, just a blank header and a total. The date field was there, but instead of a date, it read 00000000. I laughed once, a short, involuntary sound, and the man's mouth moved slightly at the corner as if he was trying to remember how to smile. I asked him what town this was. He tilted his head slow and said, "You're here." That answer hit me harder than any threat. I stepped back outside and looked down the street again. The diner sign buzzed. The storefront lights glowed, but there were still no cars. No tracks. No footprints in the snow along the sidewalks. It was a town with electricity and no life. My breath fogged the air, and I watched the fog drift toward the streetlight, and as it passed through the yellow glow, it seemed to thicken as if the light itself was feeding it. I told myself to leave. Fuel was solved. Warmth was temporary. The longer I stayed, the more the silence pressed on my ears. I got back in the car and started it. The radio turned on by itself, even though I'd switched it off and it wasn't tuned to a station. It was tuned to static, thick and layered, and inside that static, the crowd murmur returned closer. now like it was just outside my windows. I reached to turn it down and froze, because the passenger seatbelt clicked softly beside me, the same crisp latch sound I'd heard before on another night, and the passenger side window fogged in a perfect oval at face height, as if someone exhaled directly onto it. I didn't look right. I kept my eyes forward and put the car in drive. I rolled out to the station and back onto the main street, and that's when I realized the stoplights weren't cycling. The green stayed green. The red stayed red. They weren't changing to manage traffic because there was no traffic to manage. They were just lit like props. I drove through the green because stopping felt like giving the town permission to keep me. At the end of the street where the town should have tapered into country road, the streetlights ended abruptly and darkness swallowed the edges. My headlights found open fields. Then woods. The GPS arrow still floated on blank, nothing. I drove for 10 minutes and didn't see another light behind me. Relief tried to come back. Then, without warning, my tires went quiet again and the steering went light, and I realized the road was glaze all the way out here too. The darkness around me felt thicker, as if the town had been a lit doorway, and I'd just stepped back into the basement. I kept going until I hit an intersection. I recognized from earlier in the night a leaning reflective sign, a shallow dip, the same scuffed yellow arrow. My stomach dropped. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't looped. But the landscape repeated. I slammed my eyes to the clock. The minutes had advanced, but it felt like the road was folding on itself. I told myself I'd simply gotten turned around leaving town. I told myself rural roads can be confusing in snow. Then my phone buzzed with a single notification that shouldn't have been possible with no service. It was a map alert. It read, "Arrived. No destination. Just arrived." I pulled over at the first safe wide shoulder I could find under a lone utility light. I got out and turned back toward where the town should have been. There was nothing. No glow on the horizon. No scattered lights. Just black woods and falling snow. I drove back the next day in daylight, with my brother following the same exit. The ramp was there. The county road was there. There was no town. No diner foundation. No gas station slab. No streetlight poles. The GPS was right. It was empty forest. But when I cleaned out my glove compartment that afternoon, I found the receipt from the purchase still warm feeling somehow, and on the back of it, pressed into the paper like it had been written with a blunt nail, were 2 words. I didn't remember seeing anyone write "stay" in lane. I knew I was looping when the same reflective deer sign appeared a third time, with the same bullet hole through the same corner, and the road was still black ice, still silent, still making it impossible to solve the problem with anything as simple as turning around. It started as an ordinary late-night drive home, the kind you've done enough times that your hands know the wheel and your mind drifts in safe autopilot. Winter punishes autopilot. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and the day's melt had refrozen into a glaze that turned certain stretches of pavement into polished glass. I felt it in the small ways, tire noise vanishing for a heartbeat, steering going light, my car drifting a few inches, even when my hands stayed steady. When that happened, I went into the winter driving version of prayer. No braking, no sharp inputs, just smooth, patient, obedient to physics. The road I took was a rural state highway, lined with pines and open fields, long, gentle curves, occasional guardrails, occasional mailboxes that looked like lonely teeth in the snow. The radio kept dipping into static in the same places, like invisible pockets in the landscape swallowed sound. I noticed the first repetition as a shrug. A billboard for a lawyer. Bright face, bold phone number appeared after a curve. 10 minutes later, after another curve and a shallow dip, the same billboard appeared again. Same torn corner, same smear of grime across the face. I told myself there were 2 identical billboards on the route. Companies do that. Then I passed a guardrail with a section bent outward, twisted, like someone had hit it and the metal had tried to crawl away. I remember it because it reflected my headlights in a jagged pattern that made my eyes twitch. Minutes later, I passed the same bent guardrail again on the same side of the road, reflecting the same jagged pattern. My stomach tightened. I checked the odometer. It had advanced, but not as much as it should have. I checked my fuel. It looked the same. I checked the clock. It said the night was moving forward. The road said otherwise. I forced myself to stay calm, because black ice demands calm. Panic is movement. Movement is spin. I drove on telling myself I'd made a wrong turn, somewhere that I'd taken a parallel road and rejoined, that the landscape simply looked similar under snow. Then the deer sign appeared again, the same one with the bullet hole, reflecting bright white, the hole a dead black dot. I felt cold spread through my chest. There was no logical way to pass the exact same sign 3 times on a straight rural highway without turning around. I had not turned around. I hadn't even changed lanes. I kept driving hands steady, trying to find a landmark that would prove progress. A small bridge crossed a shallow creek. The pavement on the bridge shone the darkest, the purest black ice, and my tires went silent for a full second. I held my breath and rolled across without braking. On the far side, a yellow arrow sign pointed right, and the lower corner of it was scuffed in a specific pattern, like someone had scraped it with a shovel. I remembered that scuff, because it looked like a face if you stared too long. I drove for what felt like 15 minutes and crossed the same bridge again. Same creek. Same scuffed arrow sign. Same silence under my tires. My brain tried to rebel. I wanted to stomp the brakes and stop the world, to get out and stand on the road and prove it was solid. The ice made that impulse feel suicidal. Stopping on glaze in a dark curve is how you become a stationary target for whatever else travels winter roads. I didn't stop. I talked out loud, instead narrating like it might anchor reality. I said the time. I said my destination. I said the name of the town ahead. The words sounded thin inside the cabin. The radio static thickened as if it disliked my voice. My phone had no service. I turned the navigation on anyway, choosing my own home address, needing the calm authority of a route line. The GPS drew a straight blue line forward and predicted arrival in 27 minutes. I drove 10 minutes. The ETA stayed 27 minutes. I drove another 10. Still 27. The blue line never changed, never rerouted, never acknowledged the loops. It was as if the map believed in progress, even when the road didn't. The air inside the car began to smell faintly metallic, like wet pennies, like a basement drain, and I checked the vents, convinced something had crawled into my engine. Then I heard a small sound beside me, the passenger seatbelt sliding, slightly fabric, whispering against itself, like someone shifting their weight. I did not look. I couldn't afford to look when the tires were silent. I kept my eyes forward and watched the lane lines glide under my headlights like rails. Another repetition came, and this time it wasn't a sign. It was a car. A dark sedan sat on the shoulder with its hazards blinking, weakly angled slightly toward the ditch. I recognized it because one of its taillights was cracked in a specific way, half glowing, half dead. I eased past, staying centered in my lane, refusing the pull of sympathy and the trap of stopping. 2 miles later, the same sedan appeared again, same cracked taillight, same hazard rhythm, same angle. I felt my throat tighten. The 3rd time it appeared, there was a person standing beside it, waving slowly, palm up, beckoning. Their face was hidden by the hood of their coat. Their wave didn't speed up as I approached. It stayed slow, steady, confident, like they knew I would have to pass them again anyway. The road dipped, and my tires went quiet. The steering went light. I realized the loop wasn't just geographic. It was tactical. The ice wasn't merely a condition. It was a mechanism. It kept me moving forward while the landscape reset, offering the same bait again and again, until I made the mistake it wanted. I tried to break the pattern. At the next side road, I signaled and turned off the highway, choosing a narrower county route that cut into the woods. The moment my wheels crossed onto it, the tire noise vanished completely. The car floated. The county road was a sheet of black glass under the trees. Branches arched overhead, like ribs. My headlights made a tunnel that ended in darkness. I drove straight slow, feeling the road take control in a way the open highway hadn't. I passed no houses, no mailboxes, no reflectors. After several minutes, the trees thinned, and I emerged onto my original highway at the same bent guardrail, at the same deer sign with the bullet hole at the same scuffed yellow arrow. My skin prickled. I hadn't turned around. The county road had returned me, as if it were a hallway that only led back to the same room. The radio turned on by itself, volume higher than I'd left it, and poured out thick static layered with a faint murmur like a crowd. Inside the murmur, a single whisper surfaced close and intimate, as if spoken from the passenger seat. Again, my hands tightened until my fingers hurt. I considered stopping under the brightest streetlight I could find, but there were no streetlights, only the cold white wash of my own beams. I considered accelerating hard to outrun the loop, but on black ice, acceleration is a lie, speed without control. The loop didn't feel like something you outran. It felt like something you complied with. So I did the only thing I hadn't tried. I stayed perfectly in my lane and refused every invitation. I didn't drift toward the shoulder for the sedan. I didn't slow for the waving figure. I didn't change routes. I drove like a train on tracks, focused on the white line, focused on smoothness, focused on not giving the ice a reason to swing me. The repetitions continued, but something changed. The intervals between them stretched. The deer sign appeared again, but this time, the bullet hole was gone. The bent guardrail appeared again, but it looked slightly less twisted. The billboard appeared again, but the torn corner had moved, as if the road was editing itself while I watched. My heart hammered with the sick realization that the loop wasn't fixed. It was responsive. It was testing me. And then after what could have been minutes or hours, I had stopped trusting the clock, and the landscape finally shifted into something new. A lit intersection I recognized from near my home, a familiar convenience store sign, a real streetlight that actually cycled. Relief hit so hard my eyes stung. I drove home, pulled into my driveway, and sat with the engine running, waiting for the world to snap back into the loop. It didn't. I went inside and didn't sleep much. In the morning, I opened my car door to daylight and found the passenger seatbelt buckled tight across an empty seat, locked into the latch with so much tension that the fabric hummed when I touched it. On the passenger side window, in the thin frost, there was a single clean line, wiped downward, straight and deliberate, like a finger had traced the path the whole night had demanded. Stay in lane, stay smooth, don't stop, don't turn, don't look away. I picked him up because the road was already trying to kill me, and in that headspace you start thinking the most dangerous thing is the weather. Black ice has a way of shrinking your world down to the next 10 feet of headlights, and the next decision you can't undo. I'd been driving for hours on a rural interstate that cut through woods and open fields, the kind of stretch where winter feels like it owns the map. The storm had thinned to drifting snow, but the temperature kept dropping, and the pavement looked harmless until it flashed like lacquer in certain patches. Every time my tire noise vanished, that quiet glide returned, and my hands tightened on the wheel, as if grip could be transferred through skin. I wasn't sleepy enough to nod off, but I was tired enough that my thoughts felt slow and sticky. That's why I noticed him in the first place, because it was the only human thing in a landscape that had stopped feeling human. He was standing on the shoulder at the edge of an on-ramp hood, up one arm raised, in that classic hitchhiker gesture that looks brave in movies and looks insane in real life. The rational part of my brain said, keep going. The stubborn part said nobody should be out here in this cold. Then the softer part, some leftover piece of decency, said you can at least stop at the top of the ramp, where it's flatter, where it's safer, where you have more room. The moment my brain formed that plan, my tires went quiet, and the road reminded me who was really in charge. I couldn't stop immediately without risking a spin, but the ramp ahead was salted, or at least it looked salted under my lights, and I told myself I'd do it. Smart, signal, drift smoothly, let the car slow, naturally, stop under the ramp light, keep. The doors locked until I decided what was real. I took the ramp with the gentlest inputs I could manage. The car floated for a second, then the tires hit grit and traction returned in a sudden bite that made the steering wheel heavy again. I rolled to a stop under a single orange sodium light that made the snow look dirty and the night feel older. The hitchhiker approached immediately. That was my next warning. Real hitchhikers hang back until you invite them closer. This guy came right up to the passenger door, as if he'd already been assigned that side. He tapped the glass, once polite. I cracked the window a half-inch. Cold air, knifed, in carrying that faint metallic smell I'd started associating with bad nights, like wet pennies and basement pipes. He said he'd been waiting for hours, that his phone died, that he just needed a ride to the next town. His voice was normal, tired, careful. He didn't sound high. He didn't sound aggressive. He sounded like someone who'd rehearsed sounding harmless. The sodium light showed me part of his face, pale skin, chapped lips, eyes that seemed a little too steady. He smiled once, quick, like he knew what I needed to see. I asked where he'd come from. He gestured vaguely back down the ramp toward darkness. I asked why he wasn't waiting inside, somewhere warm. He said, "It's closed." That didn't make sense. There wasn't anything to be closed out here. I should have driven off right then. Instead, I told him to stand where I could see both his hands, and I unlocked the passenger door. The lock clicked loud in the quiet, and something in my chest tightened, as if I'd just signed a contract. He got in fast, too fast, like he was afraid of being left outside. The cold followed him in. The cabin temperature dropped instantly on that side, and the smell intensified, metallic, damp, wrong. He didn't buckle the seatbelt. That detail mattered because everyone buckles now. It's reflex. Instead, he sat very still with his hands on his knees, facing forward as if he wanted to match my posture. I kept my eyes on the road and pulled back onto the ramp, accelerating gently, keeping the movement smooth. Black ice demands smoothness, and smoothness demands you focus. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal. He told me his name, something common that slipped off my memory the moment he said it. He asked where I was headed. I gave a vague answer and kept my gaze fixed ahead. The radio, which I'd left off for most of the drive, turned on by itself at low volume and poured out thick static. I reached to turn it down. My hand stopped halfway when the hitchhiker spoke without changing his tone. "Don't..." The word was quiet, but it landed with weight like a hand on my wrist. I froze, then forced myself to move again because freezing behind the wheel is its own kind of crash. I turned the radio off anyway. The silence felt sharper. He didn't argue. He just sat there still, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The interstate merged, and the road stretched ahead, dark and glossy in patches. My tires went quiet again, and I could feel the car begin a gentle drift within the lane, like a boat responding to current. I corrected smoothly. The hitchhiker didn't sway with the movement the way passengers do. He stayed centered, steady, as if he had traction in a place the car didn't. That was the moment I started to feel like I hadn't picked him up so much as allowed him to join me. I glanced at him for a fraction of a second when the tires sounded normal again. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the road ahead as if he were watching a second lane line I couldn't see. His breath did not fog the window. Mine did. The passenger side glass stayed strangely clear, except for a perfect oval that bloomed once at face height and then faded like someone had exhaled close and then pulled back. I asked him if he was cold. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "You shouldn't stop for anyone." I felt irritation flare absurd and defensive. "I didn't stop for anyone," I said. "I stopped for you." He turned his head slowly, and the movement was too smooth like a camera pan. He looked at me and smiled. Again, small and controlled. "Exactly," he said. The road ahead dipped, and the asphalt shone like oil. Tires went silent. The wheel went light. My body wanted to panic. I stayed smooth, eyes locked on the lane. In the corner of my vision, the hitchhiker's shoulder seemed to lean forward slightly, as if he were looking over the dashboard with me. The smell of wet pennies filled my nose. Then I heard the crisp click of a seatbelt. Latch not from the passenger seat where it should have been, but from the back seat, behind me. The sound was unmistakable. Metal tongue into buckle, followed by the faint whisper of fabric tightening. My blood went cold. I did not look in the mirror. Looking away on black ice is how you drift into the ditch. I kept my eyes forward and asked in a voice I tried to keep flat, "Did you bring someone with you?" The hitchhiker didn't turn. He didn't blink. He said, "Don't look." That was worse than any answer. The radio turned on again by itself, static flooding the cabin, and inside the static there was a layered murmur, like multiple mouths whispering at different distances. The whispering rose, then stopped suddenly like a crowd deciding to listen. My tires found grit, and traction returned. The wheel went heavy. I dared a glance to the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. No person. No shadow. But the rear window was fogged from the inside, and in that fog were 5 long fingerprints, pressed clean through it as if someone had braced themselves there, watching the highway behind us. I swallowed hard. I looked back to the passenger seat. It was empty. The hitchhiker was gone. Not slumped, not ducked down, gone. The passenger door was still closed. The window was still up. The seatbelt lay slack in its loop, like it always had. For a second, my mind tried to reject the image, tried to insist I'd never let anyone in. Then my passenger floor mat caught my headlights reflecting off something wet. A single damp, bare footprint, toes, pointed toward my pedals. I stared forward, heart hammering, and refused to touch the passenger door handle. The next exit appeared, and I took it because I needed light, and witnesses, and walls. At the bottom of the ramp, under a streetlight, I rolled to a stop, and turned on the cabin light. The back seat was empty. The front passenger seat was empty. The only evidence was the smell, and the fog, and the fingerprint marks on the rear glass that were slowly fading as the defroster worked. I got to a gas station parked under cameras, and forced myself to open the passenger door. Cold air spilled out, carrying that wet penny basement smell, as if it had been trapped in the upholstery. On the seat fabric was a darkened oval, like damp clothing had pressed there. On the inside of the passenger window, in the thin film of grime, a single word had been traced with a fingertip, letters clean and deliberate. Stop. I wiped it with my sleeve and it smeared, but didn't disappear completely, as if the oils had sunk into the glass. I sat back in the driver's seat and stared at the road beyond the station lights, glossy and waiting. I realized then that the hitchhiker hadn't needed a ride to town. He'd needed a ride into my car, into my attention, into the moment when black ice made me too busy surviving to notice what else had climbed in behind me. I saw the red eyes, because my headlights caught them at the exact moment the road went silent, and once you've felt that silence, you understand why winter sightings never sound believable. Black ice creates the perfect conditions for doubt. You can't stop to verify. You can't turn around safely, and your brain will do anything to protect itself from admitting you're helpless. I'd sworn after the hitchhiker incident that I wouldn't drive rural roads at night again, but winter doesn't care about vows. Work ran late. The forecast said flurries nothing serious. The temperature drop came anyway, and by the time I was on the 2-lane, cut through the woods, the pavement was shining in certain patches, like it had been varnished. I drove slow, both hands on the wheel defroster, on high radio off. I kept telling myself simple rules, smooth inputs, big following distance, don't brake on curves. The trees were tall and close branches, heavy with old snow, and the darkness between trunks looked thick enough to hold shape. The road dipped into a shallow valley, then curved right. My tires went quiet, right as I entered the bend. That hush spread through the cabin like a pressure change. The steering went light. The car began a gentle slide toward the center line. I corrected smoothly, barely moving the wheel, and held my breath. That's when the eyes appeared. 2 points of red low among the trees on the outside of the curve, reflecting my headlights in a color that didn't feel like deer shine. Deer eyes reflect pale yellow-green. These were red like brake lights, deep and steady. They weren't far back in the woods. They were close enough that I could see the faint suggestion of a head shape behind them, but the head itself seemed to dissolve into shadow. The eyes tracked my car, moving smoothly as I slid through the curve, staying level, staying fixed on me. I told myself it was an animal, and the red was a trick of angle, a reflective marker, something rational. Then a second pair lit up beside the first. Then a third, higher up, as if whatever was watching had different heights, different bodies, or the ability to change its posture without changing its location. The road kept pulling my car forward. I couldn't stop. I couldn't stare. I couldn't afford to let my attention leave the lane. I forced my eyes back to the white line and guided the car through the bend. The way you guide a glass across a table you don't want to shatter, slow and careful and pretending confidence creates friction. My tires hit a salted patch, and the hiss returned. Traction bit. The steering wheel felt heavy again. I exhaled and glanced back toward the trees in my side mirror. The red eyes were still there, but they weren't in the same place. They were closer to the roadside now, just beyond the ditch, as if they'd moved while I was looking away. And the movement hadn't left any disturbance in the snow. No branch sway, no crunch, just relocation. Silent and precise. A minute later, the road straightened, and I told myself I'd imagined the shift. Then the smell returned, the faint, metallic, wet penny basement smell that didn't belong in my cabin. I checked my vents. I checked my cup holders. I checked the passenger seat without turning my head fully, just a peripheral confirmation that it was empty. It was. Still, the smell thickened. My rear window fogged suddenly, in a tight oval, not from general humidity, but from a concentrated breath, and I felt my skin crawl because I recognized the pattern. I told myself not to look in the mirror. I looked anyway. The back seat was empty. The fog oval sat on the rear glass at face height, and through it 2 small red points reflected faintly as if eyes were looking in from behind me. That was impossible. There were no headlights behind me. There were no cars. I forced myself to look forward again. The road ahead shimmered dark in patches. Another curve approached this one left bordered by thicker woods. My tires went quiet again right before the curve, and, as if summoned by that silence, the red eyes appeared ahead, not to the side this time, but deeper, in the trees directly facing the road, arranged like a line of markers at varying heights. They weren't fleeing. They weren't startled. They were waiting. And then, at the edge of my headlights, something pale moved between trunks, low and fast, like a crawler on all fours. Except it moved without slipping on the glazed underlayer that had nearly spun my car. The shape stopped at the ditch and lifted its head. The red eyes now belonged to it 2 points, burning steady in a face that didn't reflect my headlights so much as absorb them. My throat tightened. I eased off the gas, keeping the wheel straight, trying to increase my control. The car didn't slow the way it should have. The road was glass again. Black ice. I was sliding forward toward a curve, where the tree line seemed alive with watching eyes. That's when I noticed something that made it feel less supernatural, and more like a coordinated trap, a reflective strip on a tree trunk ahead, bright in my beams, like someone had wrapped tape around it to mark a spot. Then another strip, then another, each one placed just far enough apart to guide something through the woods parallel to the road. It wasn't random. It was a path. My headlights caught movement again, multiple pale shapes shifting behind trunks, too smooth, too synchronized, like they were pacing me from the tree line. Red eyes blinked in and out as branches occluded them. They were tracking my speed. They were anticipating my slide. My hands began to tremble. I focused on the lane. Smooth. Steady. Don't brake. Don't stare. The curve tightened, and my car drifted a few inches toward the shoulder. In that instant, a pale figure stepped out of the woods, onto the edge of the ditch. Not fully into the lane, just enough to make my brain scream obstacle. It was tall, thin, arms too long, head angled slightly as if listening. The red eyes glowed in its face. It did not slip. It stood on the icy slope of the ditch like it was dry ground. My body wanted to jerk the wheel away. I forced myself to hold steady, because black ice punishes sudden righteousness. The car slid past, and as I passed, the figure's head turned to follow my driver window with a slow, deliberate movement that felt intimate, like it was reading me. In my peripheral vision, the passenger seatbelt slackened and tightened once a subtle tug as if someone had touched it. I did not look. I couldn't. The road straightened, and my tires found grit again. The hiss returned. I accelerated gently, not to race but to create distance while I had traction. The red eyes in the woods kept pace for several seconds anyway, appearing in my side mirror between tree trunks, moving too fast for the snow conditions, never slipping. Then, abruptly, the woods ended, and an open field appeared, and the eyes vanished as if the boundary of trees was a rule they couldn't cross. I drove until I reached a lit intersection, and a small cluster of houses, real ones, with porch lights and tire tracks in the snow. Only then did I allow myself to pull over. I sat with the engine running and the doors locked, staring at my own breath, fogging the windshield. When I finally got home, I parked under my porch light and walked around the car with a flashlight. On the passenger side door low, near the sill were faint smears in the road, grime-like fingertips, had dragged along while I moved. Near the rear wheel well, in the crust of salt and slush, were two tiny red reflective specks, embedded in the grime as if something had pressed its eyes against the metal and left a trace. I scrubbed them with my glove. They didn't come off. The next morning, I checked my dashcam footage, needing the comfort of pixels. The video showed dark road, falling snow, and my car staying in its lane. No red eyes, no pale figure, no reflective tape on trees. But the audio captured something else, a faint, rhythmic scraping that rose and fell alongside my car as I took the curves, like something running parallel just outside the headlight beam, claws skittering on ice without ever slipping. And once very quietly under the scraping, a breathy whisper that sounded less like a word and more like a promise. We see you when you slide. I heard the whisper first buried under the radio static, and then I realized the static wasn't interference at all. It was a layer. Something was using it the way fog uses headlights, something to hide in while it gets close. Winter nights turn your car into a sealed room on wheels, and black ice turns that room into a slow-moving trap. I was on the interstate again, the safe route, because after everything else I'd sworn off back roads. The storm had eased, but left the world glazed. The temperature had dropped hard after midnight, and the pavement looked dry until it flashed like oil in the wrong patches. Every few miles my tires would go silent for a heartbeat, and the steering would turn light, and I would fall into that smooth, careful, obedient rhythm. No braking, no sharp moves, just keep it steady until the road gives you traction again. The radio was on low, for company tuned to a talk station that faded in and out like a bad memory. When it faded, it didn't become quiet. It became thick. The static didn't sound like empty noise. It sounded textured, almost like a crowd whispering in a distant room. I turned the volume down. The whispering stayed the same. I turned it off completely. The whispering stayed. That was the moment my skin prickled. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from somewhere else in the cabin, layered right under the heater fan, close enough that it felt like breath in my ear. My eyes snapped to the dashboard, to the vents, to anything that could explain it. The air smelled faintly metallic, wet pennies and basement pipes, like it always did when things stopped being normal. My tires went quiet as I crested a shallow rise. The wheel went light. The car floated. And right then, with my body locked into the discipline of don't panic, the whisper finally sharpened into words. Not a sentence. Two soft syllables repeated like a chant. Right. Lane. I stared ahead and kept my hands steady. My car was already in the right lane. The whisper came again closer. Right. Lane. Then another voice under it lower, almost amused. Stay. The exit sign ahead glowed green through drifting snow. I wanted off the highway, into light, into people, into anything that wasn't an empty corridor of ice. But the whispering rose when I signaled. It turned from murmur to insistence, a layered chorus that made my chest feel tight. Stay, stay, stay. My hand froze on the turn signal stalk. I cancelled it. The chorus softened, immediately satisfied, as if I'd just complied with a rule. The realization landed like nausea. The sound wasn't random. It was responsive. It wanted my behavior. It wanted to keep me in the place where black ice could manage me. I tried an experiment. I drifted slightly toward the center line, just a foot. Nothing dangerous, just enough to test. The tires went silent again, as if the road itself had heard the idea. The whispering sharp and angry, now a hard hiss against my ear. My heart hammered. I eased back to center in the lane, and the whispering relaxed into a low murmur again, like a parent soothing a child after a correction. I swallowed hard, eyes burning from staring without blinking. The car felt like it wasn't fully mine anymore. It felt like a puppet on a string that ran through the lane lines. Another patch of ice stole my tire noise, and the steering went weightless. The whispering returned in a different tone, almost gentle. "Easy," it said, and the word landed with sick familiarity, like someone who'd been in my car before. My passenger seatbelt clicked softly, a tiny metallic sound, and my stomach flipped because no one was there. I refused to look. I couldn't afford to look while floating. The radio screen lit up by itself, ghostly green numbers flickering, and then a frequency appeared that I'd never tuned to 0. "Lean?" The speaker hissed once, and inside the hiss I heard my own voice. Not a recording from the road, but my voice from a different time, calm speaking words I didn't remember saying. "If you feel the road go silent, don't stop." The phrase ended, and the whispering around it laughed a soft breath of amusement right beside my ear. "Too late," it said. The smell of wet pennies thickened. The windshield fogged in a tight oval on the passenger side, as if someone exhaled close. A single line drew down through the fog, slow and deliberate like a finger writing without letters. I felt tears sting my eyes, from fear and cold. Ahead in the far edge of my headlights, something pale stood at the shoulder near a mile marker facing the road. It didn't wave. It just watched. I kept my speed steady. I kept my lane. I refused to brake. The chorus in the cabin murmured approval, a low crowd sound like distant applause. Then, without warning, the windshield wipers slowed, as if the motor was fighting resistance. They dragged once, twice, then stopped halfway across the glass. My view narrowed instantly. My defroster, which had been blasting, dropped to a weak breath. The cabin temperature fell on one side, and the whispering grew, excited, layered, hungry. "Now," it said. My tires were silent. My steering wheel was weightless, and my visibility was shrinking. I fought the panic and reached for the wiper switch, trying to restart them without jerking the wheel. The wipers twitched, then stuck again. The whispering laughed, softly. "Hands," it said, and I realized it wanted the same thing every trap wanted: my hands, leaving the wheel at the exact moment the road had the most control. I forced myself to choose. I held the wheel with my left hand, and used my right to flick the hazard lights on. Then the high beams. Then the wipers. Again, rapid, frantic, mechanical, trying to create any change that might break the pattern. The wipers jerked free suddenly, slapping hard across the windshield as if something had released them. The defroster surged back. The cabin warmed. The whispering cut off mid-breath, like someone had slammed a door. The tire hiss returned as traction bit. The steering went heavy. I took the next exit without signaling, refusing to ask permission, and rolled into a brightly lit truck stop where diesel pumps glowed and other engines idled like a chorus of real life. I parked under a camera and sat there shaking, waiting for the whispering to return. It didn't. When I finally stepped out into the cold, the air smelled normal, just exhaust and snow. I walked around the car with my flashlight anyway because fear has become a habit. On the passenger side window in the thin road grime, a clean streak ran downward where a fingertip had wiped. And on the radio, display faintly burned into the dust, were the words "right lane," as if the static had been writing all along. I saw the truck go through the guardrail because the ice made me drift just enough to face it, and then it vanished in a way that didn't match any accident physics I've ever seen. People think winter crashes are loud, metal screaming glass, shattering horns blaring. On black ice, some of them are quiet. Quiet enough that your brain fills the silence with explanations it can't prove. It was late, close to Free A.M., and the interstate felt abandoned, except for me and a handful of semis running overnight freight. The storm had left a glaze, and the temperature drop had locked it in. The road was mostly clear, but it shone in certain patches, like polished stone. Every time I hit one of those patches, my tires would go silent and my stomach would clench. I stayed in the right lane behind a semi at a safe distance, letting it break the wind and give me a moving reference point. Its tail lights were comforting two steady red rectangles, predictable human-made. Then, A mile ahead, another truck appeared in the left lane, coming up fast. It wasn't unusual. Semis pass each other all night. What was unusual was that its lights looked wrong in the snow haze. The marker lights were dim, almost absent, as if covered in frost. The trailer looked like a tall, dark wall, sliding through the night. As it drew level with the truck in front of me, a gust of wind pushed loose snow across the lanes like a white sheet, and for a moment, the left lane truck's taillights blurred and then snapped back. That's when it happened. The left lane truck drifted just a few feet toward the median. Not a violent swerve, not the kind of motion that says, driver error. The kind of gentle glide you get when tires lose their bite on black ice. It touched the median line, and then it was as if the road pulled it. The trailer began to yaw slightly. The cab angled toward the guardrail. I watched it unfold in slow motion, because on ice, everything feels slower, and because my own car was floating too, and I couldn't do anything but watch. The truck's brake lights did not flare the way they should have. There was no spray of snow from emergency braking. It just continued its glide, calm and inevitable toward the median guardrail. The driver's side of the cab clipped the rail. Metal should have screamed. Sparks should have thrown. Instead, there was a dull, heavy impact that I felt, more than heard through the air. The guardrail flexed, like it always does, bowing under the weight. Then it opened, not snapped. Opened like a gate. The cab went through first, and for a split second, the trailer followed, the whole truck sliding into the dark space beyond the rail, where the ground dropped into a wooded embankment. I expected the trailer to catch, to jackknife, to tip. I expected debris. I expected the violent chaos of an 80,000-pound vehicle leaving the road. None of that happened. The truck slid through the guardrail, as if the guardrail wasn't there, as if the space beyond it was a smooth continuation of the road. Then the taillights disappeared. Not down into the ravine, not behind trees, but simply out. Off. Gone. Like someone had turned off a screen. The left lane was suddenly empty, and the guardrail looked intact again in my headlights, reflecting back clean metal as if it had never been hit. My chest tightened. The semi in front of me continued driving as if nothing had happened. No brake lights. No swerve. No horn. I couldn't tell if the driver hadn't seen it, or if they'd seen it, and refused to react the way people refuse to react to impossible things. My tires went quiet again, and my car drifted a few inches toward the center line, pulled by the same silent current that had taken the truck. I corrected gently, heart hammering, and forced myself to keep distance. I told myself to ignore it, to keep driving, to get to an exit and call it in. But the place where the truck had vanished pulled at my attention like a magnet. As I drew closer, my headlights swept the guardrail and showed no scrape marks, no bent posts, no shattered reflectors. The snow along the median was smooth, undisturbed, no fresh gouges. It was as if the event had been edited out of reality. I couldn't accept that, so I did the stupid thing when I reached the next exit. I took it and looped back the other direction so I could pass the spot again in daylight, or at least from a different angle. The ramp was glossy, and my tires went silent, but I managed it smoothly and rejoined on the opposite side, now heading back toward the location. As I approached, a strange thing happened. My GPS map flickered. The blue route line jumped for a second, then corrected. The radio dipped into static, thick and layered, and in that static I heard a faint, low murmur, like distant engines. Then, at the exact mile marker where I'd watched the truck vanish, my headlights caught something down in the trees. Beyond the guardrail, a pair of pale rectangles, high and parallel, reflecting light the way trailer markings do. They were too far down the slope to be at road level. I slowed by easing off the gas, not braking, and leaned forward slightly to see. My tires went silent. The steering went light. The car floated. The moment I lost traction, the rectangles in the woods shifted. They moved closer, not toward the road physically, but toward the line of sight, as if the angle was changing to let me see them more clearly. Then two small red points appeared above them, taillights faint, but real glowing between trees. I stared throat tight, and that's when I realized the taillights were not facing away from me. They were facing toward me, as if the truck down in the woods had turned around, and was now oriented nose up toward the highway watching. A sound came through my closed windows. that shouldn't have deep and low, like an engine idling just beneath my feet. It wasn't loud. It was intimate. My rear window fogged suddenly in a tight oval at face height, and through that fog a single line drew downward, slow, deliberate, like a finger writing a warning. The radio static thickened, and inside it a whisper surfaced close to my ear. It went through. My stomach turned. I didn't stop. I didn't lean out. I didn't give the road time to decide I should join it. I held the wheel steady until the tire hiss returned, and then I accelerated gently away, eyes burning from not blinking. At the next lit exit, I pulled into a truck stop and called State Patrol. I gave the mile marker. I told them a semi had gone off the road. They said they'd send someone. In the morning, when the sun came up and the roads were treated, and the world looked reasonable again, I drove back with daylight courage and watched the median carefully. There was no damage, no missing posts, no gouged snow, no tire tracks into the trees, no wreck, nothing. The only thing that remained was a new reflective marker on the guardrail, at that exact spot, bright and clean, as if freshly placed, and beside it, in the thin salt dust on the shoulder, a single, long, narrow footprint that did not show any slip pointed straight toward the median, like someone had walked there calmly to open a gate. I spun so slowly at first that my brain tried to pretend it was still steering, and that's the cruelest part of black ice. It gives you just enough time to imagine you can fix it. It was past midnight, on a divided highway that looked harmless in the dark. The kind of road locals swear is fine because they've driven it 1,000 times. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. The earlier melt had refrozen, and the asphalt had that wet, glossy shine in patches that never quite matched the rest of the lane. I was doing everything right, steady, speed wide, following distance, no sudden inputs, radio off both hands on the wheel, because winter had trained me into obedience. Then the tire noise vanished. Not a skid sound, not a squeal, nothing. A dead hush, like the road had swallowed the last proof of contact. The steering went light. The car drifted a few inches toward the center line, as if pulled by a slow current. I eased the wheel back and felt the delay, that sick lag that tells you the tires aren't biting. Black ice. I held my breath and waited for grit, salt, anything. Ahead, a gentle curve bent left around a stand of pines. I told myself to stay smooth through it. No braking, no corrections, just let the car glide. That's when a pair of headlights appeared on the oncoming side, far enough away to be safe, close enough to paint my windshield with glare through the haze. The glare hit my eyes at the exact moment my rear tires lost their last illusion of grip. The back end stepped out. Just a foot. Then two. My hands reacted with the smallest correction I could manage. The car answered late and overconfident. The rear sliding farther, and suddenly I wasn't drifting within my lane anymore. I was rotating. It didn't feel like spinning at first. It felt like the world was turning, and my car was trying to stay still. The lane lines swung across my hood. The headlights of the oncoming car swept across my side windows like a searchlight. My stomach rose as if gravity had shifted. Every instinct screamed, brake. On black ice, braking is the lever that flips you into a full spin. I did the opposite of instinct. I eased off the gas and held the wheel steady, trying to let the tires regain bite naturally. The car kept rotating anyway, a slow, helpless pirouette, and in that slow rotation, my headlights painted the roadside in slices. Snowbank, pine trunks, a reflective sign flashing bright, then gone. The median guardrail shining, then gone. And then something else. A figure, standing just beyond the shoulder, half in shadow watching. I saw it only as my lights swept past, but the image stuck because it was too still. People at a crash scene move. They wave. They flinch. This figure stood with their heads slightly tilted, like they were studying how the slide would finish. My car completed half a turn, and I was facing backward in my lane, moving forward. That contradiction broke my sense of reality. The oncoming headlights were now behind me, on the other side of the divider, passing safely, and I saw the driver's face flash for a second, eyes wide, mouth open, then gone. No horn. No stop. Just a human witnessing and continuing because winter teaches everyone the same rule. Don't stop on ice. My car kept sliding. The rear drifted toward the guardrail on my right. The shoulder was buried in snow. The ditch, a dark trough. I knew if I hit that guardrail at the wrong angle, I'd bounce, rotate again, and the road would finish what the ice started. My hands shook. I talked out loud, without meaning, to a thin, desperate narration. Keep it straight. Keep it straight. The tires found a patch of traction suddenly, not enough to save me cleanly enough to snap the car into a sharper rotation. The world whipped. The seatbelt bit my shoulder hard. My headlights flashed across the trees and I saw more shapes, not one figure now, but two, spaced along the tree line, both facing the road. They weren't running toward me. They were positioned like people who knew where a sliding car would end up. The car spun again faster, and the cabin filled with the smell. I'd come to dread wet pennies and basement pipes, impossible in a sealed vehicle, but suddenly thick enough to taste. The radio turned on by itself, pouring static into the car at a low volume like a whisper you can't quite escape. Inside the static, something soft surfaced close to my ear, so close it felt like breath, easy. The word hit me with a sick familiarity. I didn't look away from the windshield, because looking away was how you die, on ice. I tried to keep my hands steady and my movements small. The car rotated a final quarter turn and slid sideways. The right wheels hit deeper snow, and the whole vehicle jolted the change in friction, yanking the car out of its spin and into a hard sideways skid. The guardrail rushed toward my passenger door. I braced, without thinking. The impact came as a dull, heavy shove, not a violent crash, but enough to rattle my teeth and send a shock through my ribs. The car stopped, angled against the rail hazards, blinking automatically, as if the car itself understood it had entered a different category of life. For a second, there was only my breathing and the tick of cooling metal. Then, I realized how quiet the world was. No traffic, no engines, no other headlights. The oncoming car was gone. The highway had returned to empty. I grabbed my phone. No service. I tried again. One bar flickered, then vanished. My breath fogged the glass. The smell of wet pennies lingered. I kept my doors locked. I kept my hands on the wheel, as if that could keep control inside the cabin. A shadow moved on the shoulder. Slow footsteps crunched in snow, deliberate not, hurried approaching from the passenger side. Of course it was the passenger side. It's always the passenger side, the side that forces you to twist your body and give up your strongest angle. I stared forward and waited for a voice, a flashlight, beam, anything that sounded like help. Instead, a single polite tap landed on the passenger window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 spaced knocks, calm as a code. My skin prickled. I turned my head a fraction, just enough to catch the edge of a face in the strobing hazard light. Pale skin, a small, controlled smile, eyes that didn't blink at the flashes. The mouth moved. I cracked my window a hair, not enough for a hand to fit. Cold air knifed in. The voice was soft, almost kind. "You're okay," it said. "Turn off the engine. You don't want it to catch." That was the first sentence that sounded rational, and that's why it was dangerous. I didn't turn off the engine. I asked if they'd called 911. The smile didn't change. "No signal out here," they said, and I almost laughed because my phone had just proven the same thing. "I can help you," they continued. "Just unlock it. Passenger side is safest." My throat tightened. Safety language. Compliance language. The figure's hand rose and pressed flat against my window. The palm did not slide on the frost. The fingers were long, the spacing slightly wrong. Another shape appeared behind them in the dark, staying low near the rear of my car. I couldn't see details, only the suggestion of movement. My heart hammered. I hit the horn and held it down long and ugly, the only weapon that doesn't require you to open anything. The figure didn't flinch. The smile widened a fraction, like the noise amused them. The second shape near my rear paused, then retreated. A step not frightened, just adjusting. In the distance, faintly, an engine note rose, diesel heavy approaching. The figure's head tilted, listening. For the first time, the smile wavered, not fear calculation. The diesel grew louder. Amber strobes appeared around the curve, ahead plow or tow lights, real work lights that make shadows honest. The figure at my window stepped back smoothly, not slipping, and in the strobe of my hazards I saw the edge of something reflective on their coat, a strip of tape, like a marker. Then they were gone, into the dark beyond my headlight beam, absorbed, as if the shoulder had swallowed them. A tow truck rolled up behind me, lights blazing, and the driver got out shouting before he reached my door, the way real help does, because real help doesn't want you guessing. He asked if I was hurt. He told me to stay inside. He called for a trooper on the radio, like it was routine. As he hooked the winch, I looked at the passenger window, where the figure's hand had been. In the thin frost, a clean print remained 5 long fingers, pressed hard enough to leave a clear outline. The tow driver pulled me free and escorted me to a lit lot at the next exit. A trooper took my statement and nodded in that tired way that suggested my story fit into a larger file. Before he left, he asked the question that made my stomach drop. "Did they come to your passenger side first?" I nodded. He looked past me at my car and said quietly, "They wait for the spin." Later at home, I watched my dashcam footage. It showed my tires losing grip. It showed the spin. It showed the guardrail impact. It did not show the figure on the shoulder. It did not show the hand on my window. But the audio captured 3 distinct taps on glass spaced like a code, and right after them, under the static that shouldn't have been there, a soft voice that wasn't mine easy. In the morning, in daylight, I found something tucked under my passenger door. Weather strip. A thin strip of reflective tape, freshly pressed like someone had tagged my car the way hunters tag a trail. I peeled it off, and it left behind a clean line in the grime shaped like an arrow pointing forward, as if the road wanted to remind me what black ice always does. Once you start spinning, you don't get to choose who finds you. I realized there was a killer working the ice when the tow driver knew my name and I had never told it to anyone on the road. People imagine serial killers as monsters in alleyways. Winter creates a cleaner job. No chase, no struggle, just a car delivered by physics to the right place at the right time, and a person too shaken to question a warm voice. The night it almost happened to me, it started with something stupidly ordinary. An amber advisory on my phone about black ice, a late drive I couldn't avoid, and a stretch of highway I'd convinced myself was safer because it was bigger and better maintained. The storm had left a glaze, and the temperature drop locked it in. The pavement looked mostly dry until it flashed like oil under my headlights. I stayed in the right lane, steady, speed, wide distance, hands calm, mind repeating rules. Then in one glossy patch, near a shallow dip, my tires went silent, and the steering went weightless, and I felt the car begin the gentle drift that always precedes the panic. I corrected smoothly. The car answered late, and the rear stepped out a fraction. Not enough to crash, enough to remind me that I was one mistake away from spinning into the shoulder. When I finally hit a salted strip, and the hiss returned, I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath for miles. That's when I saw the hazard lights ahead. A car sat on the shoulder, angled into the ditch hazards, blinking weakly through blowing snow. The scene looked familiar, because winter scenes always look familiar. A stranded driver, a bad patch of ice, a helpless vehicle. As I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The car wasn't positioned like a loss of control slide. It was too neat, too perfectly angled. The hazard rhythm was steady, almost timed, and there were no footprints around it, no door open marks in the snow, no signs of a person moving back and forth for help. Still, decency tugged at me. I slowed by easing off the gas, not braking, staying in my lane. The moment my speed dropped, my tires went quiet again, as if the road punished the idea of stopping. I kept rolling. As my headlights swept the stranded car, I saw the driver's seat was empty. Then I saw the back seat. Something pale moved there. A shift of fabric or a face turning away. My heart hammered. I didn't stop. I didn't stare. I kept going and watched it in my mirror until it vanished behind snowfall. 2 miles later, a set of amber strobes appeared ahead on the shoulder tow lights. Relief hit so hard it made my eyes sting. Help for that car. A professional. A controlled situation. The tow truck was parked with its rear facing the lane lights, flashing bright amber that washed the road in alternating glare. I signaled early and moved left to give space, doing what drivers do around roadside assistance. The moment my left tires touched the center lane, my tire noise vanished. Black ice again, right where the tow truck's glare made depth and texture hard to read. My steering went light. My car drifted a few inches. I corrected gently, and in that slow, helpless glide, I watched the tow truck driver step out from behind his rig and walk toward the edge of my lane, raising one arm in a slow-down gesture. He wore a heavy jacket with reflective striping. He held a flashlight, angled down, not into my eyes like he knew how to look professional. He pointed toward the shoulder ahead of him, indicating I should pull over. That alone wasn't unusual. Sometimes tow drivers direct traffic, but something about his timing was wrong. He didn't wave me past. He didn't motion me away from the ice. He wanted me stopped right here near his truck, where the road was glass and the shoulder was packed, snow over ice. I eased off the gas and tried to drift right. The car responded late and slid a little too far the rear, stepping out enough to threaten a spin. My throat tightened. The tow driver's flashlight beam moved up, not to blind me, but to track my driver door like he was already thinking about handles. I kept my movements smooth and refused to brake hard. My car slid onto the shoulder and slowed in the packed snow, stopping angled with my hazard lights blinking. The tow truck's amber strobes painted my cabin like a warning. The driver approached my passenger side first. Of course he did. Passenger side forces you to turn, to reach, to open your body. He knocked once polite. I kept the window up and asked through the glass if he called State Patrol. He smiled, small and controlled, and held up a hand like, calm down. Then he said my name. Not miss, not ma'am, not buddy. My name clearly, as if it were printed on my forehead. My stomach dropped. You're shaken. It's okay, he said, still smiling. Turn off the engine. I'll get you warm. I stared at him and felt the cold bloom behind my ribs. My name could be guessed from a plate lookup if he had a friend with access, or from paperwork if he'd been watching me, or from something worse, something that had tagged me after my last spin. I looked at his jacket stripe and saw a thin strip of reflective tape on the cuff that looked identical to the piece I'd found under my passenger weather strip days earlier. My hands tightened on the wheel. I asked for his company name. He didn't answer. I asked to see his ID. His smile tightened, the first sign of irritation. It's freezing, he said softly. You can't stay in the car. That sentence sounded like concern. It was also the oldest trick on winter roads. Convince you that your safest place is dangerous, so you'll step into the open. My phone still had no service. The amber strobes made the world feel unreal. In the corner of my vision, the tow truck's cab was dark. No interior light. No driver silhouette. It should have been lit with gauges, with movement. It looked empty, like a prop truck. A second shape moved near my rear bumper, low and quiet, staying out of the strobe pattern. I didn't look directly. I didn't give it the respect of my full attention. I did something that felt stupid and desperate. I hit the horn and held it down long and ugly, refusing to stop the noise. The tow driver flinched slightly for the first time. Not startled, annoyed. Stop that, he said, the softness dropping. You're going to drain your battery. The mask slipped. That line wasn't about safety. It was about control. My horn kept blaring. The second shape near my rear paused. The tow driver leaned closer to the passenger window, and in the strobe of amber, I saw his eyes more clearly, steady, unbothered by flashing light, like he'd practiced working in glare. Unlock it, he said, no longer kind. Passenger side. I shook my head and kept the horn down. His smile vanished completely. He reached for the passenger handle and tested it once gentle, like confirming what he already knew. Locked. Then he tapped the glass with the flashlight. 3 spaced taps, like a code. Tap, tap, tap. My blood went cold, because I'd heard that code on another night captured on my dashcam audio when the figure hadn't been visible. The tapping wasn't a request. It was a signal. The second shape near my rear moved closer, and I felt more than saw that they were positioning. Then another sound cut through my horn diesel rumble from the road behind heavy, and real approaching fast. Blue and red flashed in the distance. Not the wrong rhythm of fake lights, but the clean pattern of a marked unit. The tow driver's head snapped slightly toward the sound. The second shape near my rear retreated a step. The tow driver leaned toward my window and said very softly, "You didn't have to make it difficult." Then he stepped back into darkness, as if he'd never been there. When the state trooper's cruiser pulled up behind me, lights washing the shoulder, the tow truck's amber strobes clicked off instantly. Not fading. Off. And when the trooper's spotlight swept the shoulder, the tow truck wasn't there. There were tire tracks in the snow, fresh and deep, but they led away in 2 directions at once, as if the vehicle had turned without turning. The trooper approached my driver's side, asked if I was okay, and I couldn't get words out at first because my body was still stuck between fight and float. I told him a tow driver had directed me to stop, had tried to get me out. I told him he knew my name. The trooper's face tightened in a way that made my stomach sink further. He asked carefully whether I'd spun out recently, whether I'd been pulled from a ditch this season, whether anyone besides police or tow companies had my information. I told him about the reflective tape under my passenger door, about the free tap code, about the figures who always came to the passenger side first. He looked past me down the shoulder, then said something that turned all the separate stories into one pattern. He said they'd been investigating disappearances on glaze nights, drivers who slid off the road and were helped by someone before patrol arrived, cars found later, with doors ajar, keys gone, phones left behind. No footprints that made sense. No suspects that stayed on camera long enough to identify. He said the working theory was simple and terrible. Someone was using black ice, like a hunting tool, setting scenes, timing, patrol gaps showing up with lights and reflective stripes, and convincing shaken drivers to do the one thing the killer couldn't force through glass open the door. The trooper escorted me to the next lit exit and waited until I was safely under gas station cameras before he left. I sat there, shaking, staring at my passenger door handle like it was a mouth. In the morning, my dashcam footage showed my car drifting onto the shoulder, my horn blaring, and then a blank shoulder with nothing beside me except amber light flickering across the snow. The audio captured a man's voice anyway close to my passenger window, saying my name and telling me to turn off the engine. The trooper told me to file a formal report and to stop driving on glaze nights if I could. I told him I didn't think the killer cared whether I drove. I thought the killer cared whether I ever spun again. 2 days later, after the temperature dropped, I went out to my driveway at dawn. Frost coated my windows. On the outside of my passenger glass, someone had wiped a clean oval at face height, like they'd stood there breathing and watching my car sleep. Below the oval, traced through the frost with a fingertip, were 2 words, written slow and deliberate. Don't stop. I stood there in the cold, with my keys in my hand, and finally understood the most terrifying part of winter roads. The ice doesn't have to kill you. It just has to make you helpless long enough for someone else to arrive and finish the job.